Hey, welcome back. Glad you're here. Tonight, we're settling in for something a little special. If you've ever found yourself half awake at some strange hour, staring at the ceiling with that low, restless kind of quiet that only comes when the rest of the world has gone to sleep, this is the perfect thing to drift off to. We are going to spend the next few hours walking, slowly and carefully, and with great attention to detail, through every major plot hole in Family Guy, every broken timeline, every character who shouldn't exist the way they exist, every moment where the show looked at its own rules, shrugged, and decided to do something completely different anyway. There's no rush. We're going to move through all of this gently, like turning the pages of an old book in a quiet room. You can close your eyes. You can let it all wash over you. The details will come to you like small, soft ripples. So get comfortable. Let the lights dim, let your breathing slow down, and let's begin. Section 1. The Griffin Family's Impossible Timeline. There is a street somewhere in a fictional version of Rhode Island. It has a modest little house on it, white trim, a red door, a lawn that somehow always looks the same regardless of the season. Inside that house, a family has been living, arguing, laughing, and completely defying the laws of time and aging for over 25 years. And the longer you look at that family, the less sense they make. Let's start with the most fundamental question of all, because it is the one that everything else eventually collapses into. How old are the members of the Griffin family? On the surface, this seems simple. Peter is the father, somewhere in his 40s. Lois is the mother, also somewhere in her 40s. Meg is the oldest child, a teenager. Chris is the middle child, also a teenager. And Stewie is the baby, supposedly around 1 year old. Simple, comfortable, the kind of setup you can understand and accept without thinking about it too deeply. But here is where things start to quietly unravel, like a sweater caught on a nail. In the early years of the show, back when everything was first being established, the age gap between Lois and Peter was addressed in the Season 2 episode Let's Go to the Hop. In that episode, it was stated that Lois is 2 years younger than Peter. That's a small detail, barely worth noting on its own. But then the show went ahead and contradicted it almost immediately. Because in Season 5's Meet the Quagmires, the story goes back in time to when Peter and Lois were both young and in 1984. And in that episode, Brian exclaims that Lois is 18, which would mean that in the year of that flashback, both Peter and Lois were 18 at the same time. Not 2 years apart, the same age, the same year. And yet both facts exist in the show as if they are equally true, sitting right next to each other in the history of two characters who have been married for decades, unable to be reconciled. Now, a gap like that you could write off. 2 years is a small thing, and the writers may have simply forgotten the earlier detail when they wrote the later one. It happens. Shows are long and writers are human. But the age problem in Family Guy goes so much deeper than a misremembered 2-year difference that it eventually becomes something magnificent in its scale. Consider the children. When the show began, Meg was 15 years old and Chris was 13. That was established clearly, early on. Stewie had just turned 1 in the 3rd episode of the first season, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, which gave him a fixed age with a fixed birthday, something the show returned to many times over the years. So in the beginning, you have a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 1-year-old. Now watch what happens as the seasons roll forward. In Season 5, Episode 10, Peter's Two Dads, Meg turns 17. That means that somewhere between Season 1 and Season 5, she aged 2 years. That's slow aging for a television show, but at least it's consistent with the idea that time is passing, even if slowly. She was 15, then she turned 17. Fine. But then you look at Chris. By Season 4, Chris was attending high school, which would make him 14 at minimum. But then in Season 9, Episode 13, Trading Places, Chris is still referenced as being 14. He started high school at 14. He is still 14 inches Season 9. He has not aged at all, while his sister aged twice. And then there is Meg again. In Season 10, Episode 10, Meg and Quagmire, Meg turns 18. So, she aged from 17 to 18. Meanwhile, Chris is still 14. So by that point in the show's run, Meg has aged from 15 to 18, a total of 3 years. Chris has aged from 13 to 14, a total of 1 year. And Stewie, who turned 1 year ago, in an early episode with a clearly established birthday, is still 1 year old across all of these same episodes where his siblings are visibly and canonically aging. Stewie has aged, by the show's own internal accounting, exactly 0 years during the same stretch of time in which his sister has aged 3. What this means, if you try to calculate it honestly, is that the Griffin family is aging at 3 different speeds simultaneously. Meg ages 3 times faster than Chris. Chris ages at a standard rate but then freezes inexplicably. And Stewie never ages at all, stuck in perpetual infancy despite having celebrated his first birthday in a named episode, in a named season, at a fixed point in the show's history. You might be tempted to say that this is just how animated shows work, that the characters exist in a kind of floating present where time doesn't apply the way it does in the real world, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But Family Guy is unusual because it actively commits to specific ages. It doesn't just let its characters float in an ageless space. It gives them birthday episodes. It gives them numbered ages in dialogue. It has characters explicitly state how old they are and reference those ages in context with other events. When you choose to do that, you're telling the audience that time matters in your world. And then when time turns out to be completely meaningless in that same world, the contradiction hits differently. It's not vague, it's specific and contradictory at the same time. Now, here is where the timeline problem extends beyond just the children. In the Season 7 episode Meet the Quagmires, there is a time travel story that takes the characters back to 1984. In that year, Peter and his friends are shown to be teenagers or young adults, going out, chasing girls, hanging out at parties. That puts Peter's birth year at roughly 1966. If Peter was born around 1966, and the show started in 1999, when Peter is established as being in his early 40s, the math holds up relatively comfortably. Peter would have been about 33 inches the pilot episode, which maps cleanly onto early 40s by the later seasons if you allow a decade to have passed. But then the show introduces other time period details that begin pulling on that thread. In the episode Brian Griffin, Portrait of a Dog, a flashback places Peter picking up Brian off the street a few years before the show began. In Season 11, Episode 13, Criss Cross, a flashback shows Brian as a puppy being born in a puppy mill in Houston, Texas. That flashback places Brian's puppyhood at a certain point in Peter's life. And when you try to match that up with the Meet the Quagmires timeline, the math starts misbehaving. Brian was born in the flashback, grew up, became a stray, and was picked up by Peter. But the time between Brian's birth and his appearance as a fully grown adult dog in the pilot episode, mapped against the 1984 flashback of young Peter, produces a timeline that requires Brian to have aged extraordinarily quickly in some stretches and barely at all in others. There is also a detail established in an entirely separate episode that creates an entirely different problem. The show confirmed at some point that Brian is 10 years old in dog terms. Standard dog aging would make a 10-year-old dog roughly equivalent to a 70-year-old human. But Brian is presented throughout the show as being in the equivalent of his late 20s to mid-30s. As someone who drinks martinis and reads literary fiction and has romantic relationships with adult human women of a certain age, the show cannot decide whether Brian is old or young, whether he ages like a dog or like a person, whether his internal age matches his physical age or something else entirely. And it never tries to resolve this because the resolution doesn't matter. What matters is that Brian feels the right age for whatever the episode needs him to be. This is, by the way, one of the most honest things you can say about Family Guy's relationship with time. Time in the show does not move forward in a coherent direction. It expands and contracts to suit whatever story is being told at that moment. Characters are as old as the episode needs them to be. Events happened as far back or as recently as the scene requires. The past is not a fixed record. It is a resource to be drawn from selectively, shaped into whatever shape the current joke needs, and then put back on the shelf without worrying about whether it matches anything that came before. This is actually a very old tradition in animated storytelling. The Simpsons has done it for even longer. South Park has done it. It's not unique to this show. But what makes Family Guy's version of this problem interesting is the sheer number of specific, named, numerically confirmed details the show has locked in over the years, only to contradict every one of them later. The show has stated Meg's age 4 times and given 4 different answers across different seasons. It has stated Peter's age at 3 different points and produced 3 different numbers that don't quite line up. It has established birthday episodes for characters who never age and flashback episodes for characters whose pasts keep changing shape. And there is one more layer to this temporal puzzle that deserves its own moment of attention before we move on. In the episode E, Peter Bus Unum from Season 2, it was discovered that the Griffin home at 31 Spooner Street was not actually part of the United States. It wasn't registered in any city map. Peter used this to declare the property its own independent nation, which he called Pretoria. Eventually, things resolved and the house was absorbed back into the country. But think about what that means for the family's existence up to that point. The Griffins had been living in a house that, by the show's own canon, technically did not exist on any official map until that episode. Which means that any document, any record, any tax filing or school enrollment, or driver's license or birth certificate associated with 31 Spooner Street would have been issued to a non-existent address. Now, this is obviously played for humor, and nobody expects a cartoon to have airtight municipal documentation. But it does raise a wonderful question that the show never answers. How did Meg get enrolled in James Woods Regional High School? How did Chris? When the school calls to confirm the address of enrolled students, what do they see? A blank? A mystery? A parcel of land that, legally speaking, is not part of their country? The house itself is a separate problem that we will visit in more detail later. For now, just hold on to the fact that the Griffin family lives at an address that the show established, in its own canon, does not exist on any map, and that this detail was never followed up on. Life at 31 Spooner Street simply continued as if the entire nation of Pretoria had been a minor inconvenience, rather than a fundamental restructuring of the family's legal reality. Before we keep going, take a breath. Let the air in slowly. Let it out slowly. There's no hurry here. We are just exploring the quiet, strange space where a cartoon family's history doesn't quite add up, and finding something almost meditative in the distance between what we're told and what would actually make sense. If you're listening right now, I'd love for you to drop a comment below and let me know the time and place you're watching from. There is something wonderful about knowing that someone in a completely different part of the world is lying in the dark with this same video playing softly in the background. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing that now. It means more than you know, and it helps this channel grow into something even more worth falling asleep to. Now let's keep going. Section 2. Brian Griffin, the dog who defies logic. There are 2 versions of how Brian came to live with the Griffin family. Both of them are presented by the show as the real version. Neither of them is wrong because the show never chose between them. And the fact that both versions exist simultaneously in the same continuity is one of the most quietly puzzling things about a show that is built on quietly puzzling things. Let's take them one at a time, like pages in a book. Version 1. In the Season 1 episode Brian, Portrait of a Dog, the backstory of how Brian ended up with the Griffins is established through a flashback. In that flashback, Peter encounters Brian on the street, where Brian has been living as a homeless stray. He was washing car windshields for loose change, as one does when one is a talking dog with no fixed address. Peter takes pity on him. He brings him home. He offers him a place in the family, and Brian accepts. This is the foundational origin story. Brian was a stray. Peter rescued him from the street. The family adopted him out of kindness and compassion, which is a genuinely sweet way to establish the relationship between those 2 characters. Version 2. In the Season 7 episode, The Man with 2 Brians, Brian shows the family some old videos from when he was a puppy. And in those videos, in footage that the show presents as home movies, Brian is already in the Griffin house as a puppy, not as a stray on the street, not as a dog Peter happened to find wandering around, but as a puppy who is already, clearly, living in the home from a very young age. These 2 origin stories cannot both be true. If Brian was living in the Griffin house as a puppy, he was not a stray that Peter found on the street as an adult dog. If Peter found him on the street as an adult stray, there are no home movies of him as a puppy in the Griffin house. The 2 accounts sit in the show's history like parallel universes, both real from their own angle, impossible when viewed together. Then, just to make sure the confusion was thoroughly complete, the show returned to Brian's origin in Season 18, Episode 11, Shortcuts, where the adoption story was revisited and confirmed once more. In this version, Brian was adopted from the street, and it was added that when Peter took him in, Brian had to leave behind a friend named Shredder, who has remained angry at him ever since for abandoning him. So in this version, Brian was definitely a stray adult dog, definitely living outside, definitely picked up by Peter as a grown animal. No puppyhood in the house, no home movies. Just a dog on the street making the best of a hard situation until a large, well-meaning man in a white shirt offered him something better. 3 versions, all canon, all contradictory. The show never explained the discrepancy because the show never felt the need to. But Brian's impossible timeline doesn't stop at his origin. Because Brian has done things in his life that, when you line them all up, create a biography that is structurally impossible for any being to have lived. At various points in the series, it is established or strongly implied that Brian attended Brown University, where he is one class short of graduating. He served in the Peace Corps. He has been writing a novel for years, a novel that he can never finish, a creative project that has become the central running gag about his intellectual pretensions and his inability to follow through on his ambitions. He hung out with Andy Warhol in what would have been the 1970s, though this is likely one of the show's reality-bending gags. He spent some time living as a stray. He was born in a puppy mill in Houston, Texas. His mother, Biscuit, gave him away at a young age so he could have a better life. His father, Coco, was hit by a truck. He somehow made his way to Rhode Island. He is, biologically, a 10-year-old dog, now. If Brian is 10 years old, and the show began in 1999, he was born in approximately 1989. A puppy mill in Houston in 1989 is where the story begins. He was given away, traveled to Rhode Island, somehow enrolled at Brown University, somehow served in the Peace Corps, somehow wandered the streets of New York and washed windshields for change, and was eventually picked up by Peter, all by the time he was, at most, a few years old. He attended an Ivy League school. He developed the sophisticated literary tastes and the dry wit of a cosmopolitan adult. He built an entire personality of refinement and culture. And he did all of this between being born in a puppy mill in Houston and being adopted by Peter Griffin, who at the relevant moment in time would have been somewhere in his mid to late 20s. The math simply cannot be made to work. There is not enough time, even by generous estimates, for Brian to have done all the things the show claims he did and still be the age the show says he is. He is either older than 10, which contradicts the stated age, or he isn't a dog in the traditional biological sense, which contradicts his stated nature, or the show simply accumulated details over the years without stopping to check whether they could all coexist, which is almost certainly the actual answer. And then there is the question of Brian's son. In the Season 7 episode, The Former Life of Brian, it is revealed that Brian has a 3-year-old son named Dylan. Dylan is the result of a relationship Brian had years earlier. He is human-presenting, with no apparent dog traits, which is itself a fascinating biological question the show declines to address. But here is the problem. Brian is canonically 10 years old. 10. A decade. 10 of the years that make up human existence, but compressed into the lifespan of a Labrador retriever. And he has a 13-year-old son, a son who is 3 years older than his father, who is biologically impossible even accounting for the loose time rules of the show, because no version of Brian's life has him fathering a child before he was born. The show acknowledged this problem, in its own sideways way. There is actually a moment in the episode where characters point out, or at least gesture toward, the absurdity of a 10-year-old dog having a teenage son. But pointing at an impossibility and chuckling about it is not the same as resolving it. The son exists. He is 13. His father is 10. Both facts stand in the show's record, unresolved and unresolvable. And since we're in Brian's timeline, we should spend a moment with the matter of Brian's death. Because Brian died, definitively and emotionally, in the Season 12 episode, Life of Brian. He was hit by a car on Spooner Street. The family grieved. Stewie was devastated. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, was brought in to fill the void, and the internet lost its mind. For a few weeks in 2013, the death of Brian Griffin was a genuine cultural event. People sent letters to the show. Petitions circulated. Entertainment news outlets covered it as a real story about real grief, which is a fascinating thing to observe about the relationship between audiences and the fictional characters they love. Then, 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device to go back and prevent Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back to life. Everything reset. The grieving was over before it had the chance to really mean anything. Now, from a plot hole perspective, this is interesting for several reasons. First and most obviously, Stewie had destroyed his time machine in the same episode where Brian died. He destroyed it explicitly because time travel was becoming too dangerous. He made a conscious choice to give up that ability. But then when Brian died, Stewie encountered a past version of himself at the mall who happened to have a return pad. He borrowed that return pad to go back. So the time machine was both destroyed and available, depending on what the story needed it to be. But the more interesting question is what happens to the continuity of the events between Brian's death and Stewie's intervention. There is a stretch of episodes, brief but real, where Brian was dead and Vinny was the family dog. Events happened in those episodes. Conversations occurred, the family adjusted, then time was rewritten and Brian came back. But the events of those episodes still happened because they were broadcast and they exist. You watch them. The show made them. They are part of the record. And yet within the world of the show, they didn't happen because Brian's death was prevented. So what were those episodes? Did they take place in a timeline that was then erased? If so, do you remember a timeline that no longer exists? Can you grieve for something that, by the rules of the show's own time travel logic, never occurred? And here is an extra thread worth pulling on. When Brian came back, the show essentially acknowledged that his death had been a rating stunt. Whether that was the intention or not, the message sent by undoing it so quickly was that the show was willing to manufacture emotional devastation for viewer attention and then take it back before anyone had to live with the consequences for very long. Which is, in its own way, a very honest description of how this show has always handled consequences. They arrive, they feel significant, and then they quietly fail to stick. Let's not leave Brian without one more detail that rewards careful thought. In the episode Screwed the Pooch from Season 3, Peter has Brian answer questions about the Griffin family to prove that Brian is a reliable family figure. During this exchange, Brian reveals that Peter is not Meg's biological father. He mentions a man named Stan Thompson. Meg is wearing headphones and doesn't hear this. It is presented as an established fact that Brian knows because he is close to the family. But in a later episode, Season 9's Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, Brian tells Meg that life isn't fair because she looks like Peter. He says this to her face as an observation. If Brian knew that Peter wasn't Meg's biological father, and if that were genuinely true, why would he tell her that she looks like Peter? Not looks like her mother, who would be the only biological parent. Not looks like some unnamed other man. But looks like Peter, the man whom Brian himself told us is not Meg's father. Either Brian forgot what he said in Season 3, or the writers did. Either way, the two statements cannot coexist. One of them has to be wrong. And the show never came back to settle which one. Brian Griffin is a 10-year-old dog who attended an Ivy League school, fathered a teenager before he was born, died and came back to life through a time machine that had already been destroyed, has two contradictory origin stories, and casually contradicts his own stored knowledge about his best friend's family. He is, in a very gentle and low-key way, one of the most logically compromised characters in the history of American animation. And somehow that makes him feel more real than if everything about him had made perfect sense. Section 3. Stewie's weapons, time machine, and the rules nobody follows. Somewhere in the Griffin house there is a nursery. It has a crib, it has a mobile, it has pastel colors and soft shapes, and all the soft, gentle signifiers of a space designed for an infant who is still learning to be a person in the world. And somewhere inside that nursery, built into the floor and the walls and what appear to be standard baby supplies, there is a weapons laboratory that could have come out of a government defense program. There are laser guns, there are mind control devices, there are machines capable of altering weather patterns, there is a fully functional time machine, and the person who built all of it is a baby who drinks from a bottle and is carried around in his mother's arms. This is Stewie Griffin. And his situation produces, almost without effort, some of the most wonderful logical problems the show ever generated. Let's begin with the time machine, because it is the most consequential of Stewie's creations and the source of the most complex narrative tangles. The time machine was first introduced in the Season 1 episode, Mind Over Murder. when Stewie built it to avoid the pain of teething. He traveled through time to escape his discomfort. This is such a perfect encapsulation of the early Stewie disproportionate power applied to a deeply mundane problem that it might be the single best single-sentence description of what made the character great before he changed. He didn't build the time machine to conquer the world. He built it because his gums hurt. Now, the rules of this time machine shifted considerably over the course of the show's run, and the shifts were never documented or explained. They simply happened, like the weather changing without any meteorological cause. In the early episodes, the time machine had a return pad. You could travel forward or backward, and the return pad would bring you back to your starting point. This was relatively clean and coherent. Then the show began introducing complications. There was a chronological gauge. There were time dilation effects. There was the fact that in Yu-Gi-Oh! Maf, from season 11, Brian used the machine without permission and accidentally reversed the flow of time for everyone. In that episode, time running backwards caused Brian to unage, unexperience his memories, and physically move back toward birth, while the world around him played in reverse. This established that Stewie's machine did not just move people through time, but could restructure the nature of time itself for the people around the machine's user. Then in The Big Bang Theory, from season 9, the show established something even more ambitious. It was revealed that Stewie had actually caused the Big Bang, that the energy from his return pad overloaded in an attempt to bounce back into the space-time continuum from outside of it was the source of the explosion that created the universe. This means that Stewie is, technically, responsible for all of existence. He is the reason atoms assembled. He is the reason stars formed. He is the reason the planet that eventually produced the Griffin family is here at all. Without Stewie, there would be no Stewie. This is a beautiful paradox, and the show committed to it fully in that episode. But it also means something profound about every other episode that involves Stewie's time machine. If Stewie caused the Big Bang, and the Big Bang is what created the universe, and the universe is what contains Stewie, then Stewie's existence depends on a cause that has not yet happened from his temporal position at the start of the show. He exists because of something he will do in the future. But to do that thing in the future, he has to exist now, which means he is both the cause and the effect of his own existence, and the whole loop has no beginning and no end, just a circle spinning through time with a baby at the center of it. What is remarkable about this is not just the paradox itself, but the fact that the show moved forward after establishing it without any acknowledgement of what it implied for every other episode. If Stewie caused the Big Bang, he is literally the most important entity who has ever existed. Every event in the history of the universe is downstream of something he will eventually do. And yet, in the episode after The Big Bang Theory, he is presumably worried about something completely mundane, like whether Brian borrowed his things without asking, or whether his mother is paying him enough attention. The cosmic weight of being the architect of existence is not something Stewie appears to carry with him on a daily basis. The time machine's rules also shift when it comes to how much it can change the past. In some episodes, changing even minor things in the past causes enormous ripple effects in the present. In Back to the Pilot from season 10, Brian merely telling his past self about the September 11 attacks triggers an alternate future where the United States descends into a devastating civil war. One conversation, one piece of information passed to a past version of himself. Total civilizational collapse. The butterfly effect portrayed with complete seriousness. But in other episodes, far more significant changes to the past leave the present completely unaltered. Characters do things in earlier time periods that should, by any sensible application of the rules established in Back to the Pilot, produce massive consequences. They destroy things. They change events. They interact with historical figures in ways that would logically alter the course of history. And when they return to the present, everything is exactly as they left it. No civil war, no alternate timeline, no consequence whatsoever. This inconsistency is not a background detail. It is the show's entire relationship with the mechanism of its most frequently used storytelling tool. The time machine either changes everything or changes nothing, depending on which outcome the episode needs. There are no consistent rules. There is no governing logic. There is only the story that needs to happen in that particular half hour, and the time machine adjusts itself accordingly. There is also the matter of who can use the time machine and when. Early in the show, Stewie's device was clearly his alone. He had built it, he controlled it. Other characters did not have access to it because they did not know about it, and because Stewie, who was primarily at that point in the show, still committed to the image of being a secret genius, was careful about who knew what was in his nursery. But as the seasons went on, more and more characters blundered into the time machine or used it without Stewie's knowledge. Mort Goldman stumbled into the walk-in version of it in Road to Germany from Season 7, mistaking it for a bathroom. Brian used it secretly in Yugyelimaf and broke it. In Internal Affairs, Peter and the Giant Chicken accidentally ended up on the time pad and traveled to 1885. So the machine went from a closely guarded secret to an appliance that family members and neighbors could wander into when they needed to use the bathroom, which is, itself, a kind of plot hole. In the early seasons, none of the adults in the house knew Stewie could talk. They couldn't understand him, and certainly none of them knew he had a weapons laboratory in his nursery. But by the later seasons, the rules about what people could understand and what they knew were different enough that a time machine in the nursery was simply a fact of life at 31 Spooner Street, unremarkable and accessible. Which brings us to one of the most consistently discussed inconsistencies in the entire run of the show. Can the other characters understand Stewie? This is not a question with an answer. The show has taken every possible position on this and refused to commit to any of them. In the first 3 seasons, the standard presentation was that most adults could not understand Stewie. When he delivered his elaborate speeches about world domination and his hatred of Lois, the adults in the room heard a baby babbling. The comedy came from that gap. Stewie would say something devastating and eloquent, and Lois would smile and wipe something off his chin. Brian was established as one of the few characters who could genuinely hear and understand Stewie, which was a significant part of their bond. Then the rules started softening. Characters began occasionally responding to things Stewie said as if they understood them, then more consistently responding, then having full conversations with him as if the original rule had never existed. In a Season 8 episode, Love Blackshuley, the show actually addressed this in dialogue. Brian and Stewie debate whether Loretta, Cleveland's former wife, is the kind of character who could understand him. This is the show acknowledging its own inconsistency and turning it into a joke, which is clever in its way. But a joke about an inconsistency is not a solution to that inconsistency. It's an acknowledgement that the inconsistency exists, wrapped in a light laugh, and then set aside. By the later seasons, the selective hearing rule had essentially dissolved. Chris, who in early seasons clearly couldn't understand Stewie, was having regular conversations with him. Peter, who famously only half listened to anyone, would sometimes hear Stewie's sophisticated observations and sometimes treat them as meaningless noise, and the difference seemed to depend entirely on whether the scene needed him to understand or not. Lois, who is canonically more intelligent than several of the people in her household, would sometimes hear her youngest child's elaborate plans for destruction, and sometimes apparently hear only contented baby sounds. The show even created an entire paradox out of Stewie's intelligence when it came to his interactions with other babies. In various episodes, Stewie encounters other infants at daycare or in various social situations. And the other babies are normal. They cannot talk. They cannot plan. They are babies in the conventional sense. Which raises the question of what Stewie actually is. Is he a mutant? A genetic accident? A baby whose brain developed differently? The show gestures at various explanations over the years: his parentage, his possible alien heritage, Lois's behavior during pregnancy, but never settles on one. He simply is what he is, a 1-year-old with the intellectual capacity and engineering knowledge of a postgraduate student in a weapons program, surrounded by a family that sometimes can't hear him and sometimes can, depending on the needs of the moment. The weapons themselves deserve a mention in this context. Stewie's nursery has been shown at various points to contain not just the time machine but also laser weapons, a mind control helmet, a device that can shrink things down to miniature size, a weather control machine, and various other tools that would require not just intelligence but access to materials and manufacturing that a baby who cannot drive, cannot purchase, and cannot legally enter most of the facilities that would have the relevant equipment simply would not have. The show never explains how he acquires the parts. In an early episode, he is briefly shown having the materials delivered, which opens the door to the question of what credit card he's using, but that detail is dropped immediately and never followed up on. There is also the matter of Stewie's plans themselves, specifically the plan to kill Lois. In the first 3 seasons, this was not a background idea or an occasional reference. It was Stewie's primary motivation. It was why he woke up in the morning. He wanted his mother dead, and nearly every episode gave him at least one moment of moving toward that goal, whether through elaborate machinery or simple opportunistic violence. And yet Lois, at the start of the show, was completely unaware of any of it. She would pick Stewie up, she would feed him, she would carry him around in her arms, and he would be actively plotting her destruction from those same arms. But here is the problem that emerged as the seasons went on. By the time the show reached season 6 and Stewie finally appeared to succeed in killing Lois in the 2-part Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie, the whole thing turned out to be a simulation. Not real, a computer program. None of the events in those episodes actually happened within the world of the show. Everything reset. Lois was fine, Stewie was fine, and after that point, the genuine murderous intent mostly faded from Stewie's character. But here's the thing. That resolution actually created a continuity problem rather than solving one. If all of Stewie's previous attempts to kill Lois had been building toward a climax, and the climax turned out to be a simulation, then what were all those earlier attempts? Were they also just practice runs on a computer? Or were they real within the show's world? In which case Lois had genuinely been targeted dozens of times and survived, which would make her one of the most resilient people in the history of assassination targets. The show never clarified this. The simulation ending provided closure but not coherence. And one final note on Stewie before we drift on. The season 12 episode where he destroyed the time machine, the episode where Brian died and Stewie couldn't save him, was the emotional culmination of his decision to give up time travel. And then 2 episodes later, he borrowed the return pad from a past version of himself to save Brian. Having used the return pad, he then had to make sure that past version of himself went back to his own time, and the chain of events that led to the original version of this moment remained intact. At the end of all this maneuvering, the time machine was presumably rebuilt, because it appears in later episodes without comment. The destruction of the time machine, presented as a significant and final choice, was undone so quietly and with so little ceremony that most viewers probably didn't notice the moment it happened. Sleep on that. Let it rest quietly in whatever part of your mind holds the things you noticed but didn't quite hold on to. That's where all of this lives best. Section 4. The town that cannot exist. Picture the town if you can. Somewhere in a slightly misaligned version of Rhode Island, there is a place called Cog. It is a coastal town with a small city feel. It has suburbs and beaches and a bar called the Drunken Clam that seems to be located near a residential street and also, depending on the episode, very close to downtown. It has a news station, a police department, a mall, a brewery, a high school, a hospital, an airport, and somewhere in the vicinity there is a mansion belonging to a man named Carter Pewterschmidt, who is so wealthy that the town's economy seems to rotate around his interests. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, who grew up in Connecticut and studied in Rhode Island, and who based the setting on a general New England feeling rather than any specific real place. He has confirmed in interviews that the town is modeled loosely on Cranston, Rhode Island, which is part of the Providence metropolitan area. But the show has placed the town in completely different locations within Rhode Island, depending on which episode is making the reference. In the Season 2 episode, Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, a zoom out at the end of the episode places the town somewhere between Cranston and Warwick, almost directly north of T.F. Green Airport. In the Season 2 episode E, Peterbus Unum, a map of Rhode Island is shown with the town highlighted in red, and in that version the town appears to be somewhere near Tiverton, which is on the eastern side of the state near the Massachusetts border, about as far from Cranston as you can get while remaining in Rhode Island. And in another episode, the town's zip code is given as 00093, which is not a zip code that exists in Rhode Island or anywhere else in the continental United States. It is a number that falls outside the range of any real American postal designation. So the town exists in different places depending on the episode, has a postal code from a parallel universe, and has been modeled after a place it does not actually resemble when the episode-by-episode geography is mapped out. The show even acknowledged the impossibility of the house's legal status in E. Peterbus Unum, as we discussed earlier, by establishing that the Griffin home was not registered in any city map. So the house exists at a non-real address in a town whose zip code doesn't exist in a city that keeps relocating itself within a state it only partially resembles. Now, the physical layout of the town is a subject unto itself. The Drunken Clam, which is the bar where Peter and his friends spend a significant portion of their social lives, has a location that shifts episodically. In some episodes, it is walking distance from 31 Spooner Street. Peter and his friends walk there after dinner, have a beer, walk home. No journey of significance. In other episodes, characters drive there. In still other episodes, the bar appears to be near the waterfront, which would put it several miles from Spooner Street if the waterfront detail is consistent with the town's general geography. The building itself changes slightly over the years. The interior layout shifts. New areas appear and disappear. The pool table is sometimes present and sometimes not. The bar stools are in different configurations depending on the scene. None of this is unusual for a cartoon that changed animation studios multiple times, but it produces a physical space that cannot be mapped reliably. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter works for a significant portion of the show's run, is similarly mobile. In some episodes, it appears to be near the waterfront. In others, it seems to be on the outskirts of town, requiring a commute. The interior of the brewery is drawn differently in different seasons, with the layout changing in ways that cannot be accounted for by any renovation the show depicts. The brewery itself is based loosely on the Narragansett beer brand, which is a real Rhode Island brewery with a real history, but the fictional version has no fixed relationship with the real company's actual facilities. The high school where Meg and Chris attend has had its name changed. It was James Woods Regional High School for most of the show's run, named after the actor James Woods in a self-referential joke from an episode where the actor himself appeared. Then, in a later season, the school was renamed Adam West High School, after the late actor Adam West, who voiced the town's mayor until his death in 2017. The renaming was never explained within the show's world. It simply happened between episodes, as if the school board had met in the off-season and voted on it without informing the audience. The neighborhood of Spooner Street itself has a geography that cannot be made consistent. The neighbors' houses shift position relative to each other depending on the episode. Joe and Bonnie Swanson live at 33 Spooner Street, which should put them directly next door to the Griffins at 31. But in some exterior shots, the houses appear much further apart. In others, they appear to share a wall. The backyard between the two homes has expanded and contracted more times than can be counted, going from a narrow strip in one shot to a space large enough for a swimming pool and a party in another. The layout of the Griffin house itself deserves a full inventory of its contradictions, and we will give it that in a moment. But the broader point about the town is this. COG is a setting that the show treats as real and fixed, in the way that real places are real and fixed. Characters reference specific landmarks. They give directions. They describe distances. They move through the town with a casual familiarity that implies a stable geography. And yet the geography cannot be consistently described because it was never consistently designed. The show drew what it needed when it needed it, and trusted that the audience would fill in the gaps with a general feeling of small city New England rather than a specific, accurate map. What makes this more interesting than a simple production oversight is the fact that the show occasionally used the town's geography for dramatic effect in ways that required specific locations to be where they were for a scene to work. If the Drunken Clam is walking distance from Spooner Street, then a scene where Peter stumbles home from the bar carrying his buddies makes spatial sense. But if the bar is on the waterfront, the same stumbling walk home would require crossing several miles of urban Rhode Island in the dark, which the show never portrays. The geography shifts to support the scene rather than the scene adapting to a fixed geography. The population of the town is another remarkable inconsistency. In the episode Tom Tucker, The Man and His Dream, the population of the town is given as 800. 800 people. That is a small village. A hamlet with a post office and a few hundred houses and not much else. But the town depicted throughout the show is clearly not a village of 800. It has a functioning airport with multiple international flights. It has a professional sports venue. It has a news station with multiple anchors and reporters. It has a mall large enough to host major events. It has a population dense enough to support a hospital, a school district with multiple schools, an arts community, a theater, a cinema, and enough voters to hold regular mayoral elections. None of those things exist in a town of 800 people. The airport alone would require a catchment area of tens of thousands of residents to be economically viable. The town, in other words, is both a small village and a mid-sized city, depending on which detail the scene requires. It is large enough to have anonymity and small enough for everyone to know each other. It is far enough from Providence to feel like its own place, and close enough for characters to commute there for specific purposes. Its population is 800, and also large enough to fill a professional hockey arena. This is not a problem that needs solving. It is actually one of the more charming qualities of the show's setting. This town that exists in a happy state of indefinition, always the right size for the story, always in the right location for the joke. But when you start asking the questions, when you try to draw the map, the charm of the indefinition becomes a very pleasant form of chaos. Let's walk through the house itself now, because 31 Spooner Street is a place that has been visited thousands of times over the course of the show and yet cannot be described from memory with any confidence because the memory the show has given us of it changes every time we look. The exterior is relatively consistent. A Cape Cod-style house with a sloped roof, white trim, yellow or off-white siding depending on the season, and the distinctive red front door. There is a front porch that is occasionally present. There is a garage that is used sometimes for storage and sometimes for nothing. The front yard has a mailbox and a tree and a general suburban presentability that matches the neighborhood's tone, but the interior is another matter entirely. The ground floor has a living room with a distinctive green couch, a kitchen, a dining room, a room with a piano that is sometimes Lois's teaching space and sometimes just a regular living room addition, and a staircase that leads to the second floor. The positions of these rooms relative to each other shift between episodes. The kitchen is sometimes visible from the living room through an open doorway and sometimes separated by a wall. The staircase is sometimes at the back of the living room and sometimes to one side. The piano room is sometimes adjacent to the living room and sometimes seems to require passing through a different part of the house to reach. The second floor has the master bedroom where Peter and Lois sleep, Meg's room, Chris's room, and Stewie's nursery. All four of these rooms are on the second floor, which is a sloped ceiling story of a Cape Cod house. But the rooms, as depicted from the inside, have straight walls and normal ceiling heights. The exterior clearly shows a sloped roof. The interior rooms should have angled ceilings, or at least some evidence that they are under a pitched roof. They don't. They are drawn as if they exist inside a completely different structure than the one visible from the street. The IMDb Goofs page for the show explicitly notes this. Peter lives in a Cape Cod house with slanted walls on the second floor, but when the camera is inside the bedrooms, they have perfectly straight walls. Peter's man cave is another wandering space. At various points it has been in the attic. At other points it appears to be in the basement. In some episodes it is accessed through a door in one part of the house, and in other episodes through a door somewhere else entirely. There is no consistent answer to where in this house a person would go if they wanted to find Peter's private space. The basement itself appears in some episodes and doesn't seem to exist in others. Some episodes treat 31 Spooner Street as a standard Cape Cod with no basement, which would be geologically consistent with the rocky soil of coastal New England. Other episodes feature a basement that is apparently large enough to host significant activity. The house either has a basement or it doesn't, and the answer is yes on some days and no on others. There is also the matter of rooms that appear when the plot needs them. Stewie's nursery contains equipment that would require the room to be substantially larger than a standard baby's room. The laboratory equipment, the time machine, the various weapons and devices would fill a space the size of a small warehouse. But the nursery, as depicted in exterior shots of the house and in wide shots of the room, is a normal-sized baby's room. The equipment exists in a space that is physically too small to contain it. This is a cartoon, of course, and cartoon spaces often expand to meet narrative needs. But it is worth pausing on because the show establishes the Griffin home as a real, specific, physical space with a real address. Characters pay bills for it. Characters argue about renovating it. Its market value has been referenced. It is treated as a real object in a real world with real physical constraints, and those real physical constraints don't apply to it. One of the most gentle and lovely things about all of this is that the house keeps being destroyed and repaired. Over the course of the show's run, the Griffin home has been damaged or destroyed in fires, explosions, impacts, extreme weather events, and various supernatural interventions. And every time, by the following episode, it is completely intact again. No ongoing repairs visible in the background, no scaffolding or contractor vans in the driveway, just the house, whole and normal and ready for whatever happens next. The house is, in this way, as indestructible as the family that lives in it, which is perhaps the most appropriate thing about it. Section 5. Peter Griffin's Impossible Life. Let's be quiet for a moment about Peter Griffin and think about who he actually is, when you line up everything the show has ever told us about him. His name, as confirmed by his birth records in the episode Quagmire's Mom, is Justin Peter Griffin, though the name Justin has almost never been used again and exists primarily as a birth certificate detail. He was raised by Francis and Thelma Griffin. His real biological father, as revealed in the Season 5 episode Peter's Two Dads, is an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan, with whom his mother had an extramarital relationship. Peter only learns this as an adult and travels to Ireland to find the man, establishing a complicated relationship with a biological father he never knew. He was born in Mexico, as established in the episode Padre de Familia. His mother attempted to have the pregnancy terminated in Mexico but was unsuccessful, and Peter was born there before the family eventually moved to Rhode Island. He is therefore a natural-born citizen of Mexico, not the United States, which required him in that episode to go through a citizenship process and be made a legal American by the intervention of his father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt. He attended Providence High School, as stated in the episode I Dream of Jesus. He worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. He later got a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery as a safety inspector, a job he held for a large portion of the show's run. He briefly became a local television celebrity when he had a segment on the news called What Really Grinds My Gears. He has at various points been a fisherman, a farmer, and a Renaissance fair jousting knight. He is, stated in various episodes, somewhere in his early to mid-40s. In The Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou, Lois says he is 43. In Let's Go to the Hop, it is established that Lois is 2 years younger than Peter. If Lois is 42 at the time of the first reference, then the 2-year age gap would put Peter at 44, which is consistent with the 43 stated elsewhere. But in the Season 5 episode, Meet the Quagmires, when both Peter and Lois are shown as young adults together in 1984, they are both 18. Lois cannot be simultaneously 2 years younger than Peter and also the same age as Peter in 1984. One of those things is wrong. His ancestry has been explored in multiple episodes, producing a history that extends in several surprising directions. In Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, Peter discovers that one of his ancestors was a slave, specifically a man named Nate Griffin, who was enslaved in the 19th century. In Peter's Progress, an episode that casts Peter in a historical drama framing, his past life is explored as Griffin Peterson, a colonial-era figure who founded the town. These are both presented with a degree of comedic seriousness, which means they exist somewhere in the zone between outright joke and established background fact. His biological father, Mickey McFinnigan, is Irish, and presumably of Irish ancestry. His mother's family, the Griffins, represent a separate lineage. The combination produces Peter's character, a man of ambiguous heritage who was raised in an American Catholic household, moved to Rhode Island at some point in childhood, and has never clearly explained how his family got from Mexico or Ireland to Providence. Here is the problem that emerges when you try to build a coherent Peter Griffin. He has had jobs that require certifications and qualifications he clearly doesn't have. His role at the brewery as a safety inspector would require, at minimum, some form of occupational health and safety training. His brief career as a television personality would require some kind of media credential or at least a relationship with the station that gives him access. His role as a commercial fisherman would require a license. None of these credentials are ever established because establishing them would require the show to pretend that Peter passed a test or completed a training program, which is fundamentally inconsistent with a character whose core comedy is built on his inability to pass tests or complete programs. There is also the matter of how Peter consistently holds these jobs despite his behavior at work. Over the course of the show, Peter has been fired and rehired from the brewery more times than any surviving corporate HR file would allow. He has physically injured colleagues. He has destroyed equipment. He has brought animals to work. He has shown up drunk. He has caused structural damage to the building. In a real organization, any one of these events would end his employment. In the show, they serve as the premise of an episode and are resolved by the end of it, with Peter somehow still employed at the start of the next one. Peter's citizenship is a particularly interesting thread. In Padre de Familia, when it was revealed that Peter was born in Mexico, the storyline specifically addressed the legal problem of an undocumented Mexican-born citizen living and working in the United States as if he were American. Carter Pewterschmidt used his connections to have Peter made a citizen. This is depicted as a resolution to the problem. But here's the thing. Peter had already been living and working in the United States for his entire adult life before this episode. He had been employed. He had filed taxes. He had a social security number, presumably. He had children who were enrolled in school. He had voted in local elections. He had registered his car. All of these things require documentation that would have established his legal status decades before the episode Padre de Familia created a storyline about him not having that status. Either all of those documents were already in place before the episode happened, in which case the plot of the episode doesn't work because Peter was already effectively a legal resident, or none of those documents existed, in which case every other episode of the show that depicts him functioning as a normal American citizen would require a legal infrastructure he didn't have. The show chose the second interpretation for one episode, and then quietly reverted to the first interpretation for all subsequent episodes. And since we are talking about Peter's past, there is the matter of his high school. He attended Providence High School according to I Dream of Jesus. But his friend Quagmire was evidently in school with him at some point, because flashback episodes show them together as young adults in a school context. And Quagmire, as established in the Season 7 episode, Foxy Lady, is 61 years old, which would put his birth year at roughly 1938, making him old enough to have been in high school in the mid-1950s, long before Peter was even born. But the flashbacks show them as the same age in the same school. Quagmire looks 35. He always looks 35. The show explained this away by suggesting he takes special supplements, specifically that he ingests carrots in various ways to maintain a youthful appearance. This is the show's own explanation. They acknowledge that a character who is canonically 61 looks 35 and offered, as a solution, a vitamin supplement. We will spend much more time with Quagmire later. For now, just keep that number in your head, 61. And sitting at a bar with people who are in their early to mid-40s. And looking like none of them. Section 6. Death means nothing. Characters who won't stay dead. Let's talk about what dying means in this town. The short answer is that it doesn't mean very much. The long answer is more interesting. Family Guy has always had a relationship with death that functions on two simultaneous tracks. On one track, the show treats death as a genuine narrative event when it suits the story. Characters have died in ways that were clearly meant to be emotional, meaningful, and lasting. Brian's death in Season 12 was a full production, accompanied by a score, a farewell speech, a family gathered in grief. The deaths of certain secondary characters over the years were treated with genuine weight. Adam West, the actor who voiced Mayor Adam West, passed away in 2017, and the character was retired and given a proper send-off out of respect for the man. On the other track, death in this show is almost entirely without consequence for the main cast. Peter Griffin has technically died many times across the show's run. He has been killed by the chicken. He has been shot. He has been crushed. He has been killed in various alternate timeline scenarios. He has died in dream sequences. He has died in what the show explicitly labeled as non-canonical episodes, and every time, he comes back. Not through the logic of time travel or supernatural resurrection, just through the simple understanding between the show and its audience that Peter Griffin cannot actually die, because Peter Griffin is the show, and the show is still running. The same applies to every member of the Griffin family. Meg has been launched into space at least twice, with no explanation for her survival. She has survived events that would kill a human being without comment. Stewie has died in more counterfactual scenarios than can be easily cataloged, each one treated as definitively real in the moment and completely forgotten in the following scene. Lois has been shot, been presumed dead, been sunk at sea, and been apparently killed in the two-part Stewie arc that was later revealed to be a simulation. Chris has survived things that no teenage boy in the real world could survive. The family's collective mortality is approximately 0. This is not specific to Family Guy. Most long-running cartoons do this. The logic of the genre is that central characters exist outside the normal rules of consequence. But Family Guy creates an interesting wrinkle by periodically trying to make death meaningful within this context. When the show commits to a death, like Brian's, it is asking the audience to engage emotionally with a rule that the show has spent years teaching them to disregard. The audience has been trained by 20-plus seasons to understand that no one important can actually die. Then the show asks them to feel genuine grief, and when the death is undone almost immediately, it confirms the lesson that the audience had already learned. This creates a peculiar dynamic with some of the show's more emotionally ambitious storylines. When a character faces genuine danger or loss, the emotional investment is complicated by the certainty, earned through long experience with the show, that nothing will stick. The grief, the danger, the loss all feel provisional. Not because the audience doesn't care, but because the show has consistently demonstrated that caring too much is a category error. Things will be fine. They are always fine. And yet there are characters who died and stayed dead, which is its own kind of problem. Muriel Goldman, Mort Goldman's wife, was killed in the Season 9 premiere And Then There Were Fewer, shot by Diane Simmons before Simmons herself was killed by Stewie on a cliff. This death stuck. Muriel never came back. Mort eventually adjusted to life without her. The show acknowledged her absence in subsequent appearances by Mort, but Mort himself died in a later season after being lost in time and eventually ending up in a situation the show resolved with his death. And this was handled with relatively little ceremony. A character whose wife's death had been treated as a genuine dramatic event was himself dispatched later with much less weight. The consistency of how much any given death matters is itself inconsistent. There is also the matter of Mayor Adam West. The character, voiced by the late Adam West, was a recurring part of the show for years. He was eccentric, inexplicably powerful, and one of the town's most reliably absurd presences. When Adam West died in June 2017, the character was written off the show through a proper in-universe death. He was given a funeral episode. He was mourned. His passing was treated as something real. This was the right thing to do, and it was handled with more grace than many character exits. But it also established, unintentionally, a contrast with every other character's death. Mayor Adam West died because a real human being died. His death was permanent, respected, and not undone. Every other major character has died and come back without consequence. The only death that truly lasted in this town was the one connected to an actual human mortality outside the frame of the cartoon. There is something quiet and almost tender about that contrast. The rules of the show's universe only held when they had to. When real loss entered the frame, it stayed. Let's linger here for a moment. There is no hurry. The night is long, and we have a long way still to go. Section 7. The Quagmire Contradiction. Glenn Quagmire. That single chin, that perpetual expression of barely contained enthusiasm for the worst possible life choices, that wardrobe of shirts that are one button away from an OSHA violation, he has been part of the show since the very beginning, appearing first in the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door as one of Peter's neighbors on Spooner Street, an airline pilot with an apartment that functions as a kind of museum of the 1970s bachelor aesthetic, velvet furniture, lava lamps, a revolving door in the romantic sense, if not the architectural one. Quagmire is, on the surface, a simple character. He is defined by exactly two traits: his profession as an airline pilot and his relentless, boundary-defying, legally questionable pursuit of romantic encounters. These are his whole personality. The show acknowledged this explicitly in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, when Brian Griffin was subjected to one of the most famous monologues in the series, a long, detailed, brutal breakdown from Quagmire about why he hates Brian. The speech is memorable in part because it is entirely accurate, but it is also fascinating from a meta perspective because Quagmire, A character whose entire existence is built around behaving far worse than anything he criticizes Brian for, is the one delivering it. But the plot hole conversation about Quagmire is not about his personality. It is about his age. In the Season 7 episode Foxy Lady, Quagmire is revealed to be 61 years old. The detail is presented specifically. His age is not approximated or guessed. It is stated as 61. And the show explains that he maintains a youthful appearance, which he appears to be in his mid-30s, through an elaborate regimen that involves consuming carrots in various forms. Let's sit with 61 for a moment. If Quagmire is 61 during the run of seasons where Peter is in his early 40s, Quagmire was born approximately 18 to 20 years before Peter. He would have been a young adult in the early 1960s, a full adult by the late 1960s, and a middle-aged man by the time Peter Griffin was in high school in the 1980s. But the flashback episode Meet the Quagmires from Season 5 goes back to 1984 and shows Quagmire as a young adult companion to 18-year-old Peter and 18-year-old Lois. He is not 18 inches 1984. He is not even 30 inches 1984 by the carrot supplement logic. By the stated age of 61, he was 61 years old in the seasons where the show takes place. And if those seasons nominally represent around 2007 to 2010, he was born around 1946 to 1949, which would make him 35 to 38 years old in 1984. Not a peer of 18-year-old Peter. Not the same college-age energy the episode presents him with. But roughly 20 years older, which would make his presence in a social circle of teenagers and young adults in 1984 considerably more unsettling than the episode presents it. The show acknowledged the age issue in a different way in a subsequent episode, when the friends are at the bar and it is noted that Brian is technically 56 years old in human years, despite being 7 years old in dog years. This is the episode where Brian's dog age, multiplied by the standard human-to-dog conversion, produces a number that makes him old enough to drink legally in a state where the others might not be. The scene plays this for comedy, but while the characters are noting Brian's impressive human equivalent age, Quagmire is sitting at the same table as a 61-year-old man. He should be the one buying the drinks. He should, in fact, be older than the calculation suggests Brian is. But the show in that scene treats Quagmire as exactly the same age as everyone else, because for the purposes of that scene, he is. There is also the matter of Quagmire's hair. In the episode The Old Man and the Big C, it is revealed that Quagmire has been wearing a wig his entire life. He is bald underneath. He briefly accepts this and shows the world his baldness before eventually getting a hair transplant. This is a significant revelation about a character the audience has known for years. It recontextualizes every previous scene where Quagmire's hair was depicted as natural, but this contradicts an earlier episode, The Perfect Castaway, which shows Quagmire growing his hair out in a different context. If he is bald and wearing a wig, he cannot grow his own hair. If he has grown his own hair in a previous episode, he is not bald. The two details cannot coexist. The show offered no resolution because there was nothing to resolve. The wig episode happened. The hair-growing episode had already happened. Both were real. Neither was adjusted to accommodate the other. Quagmire's professional life as an airline pilot is another source of gentle confusion. The show depicts him as an active commercial pilot throughout the run of the series. He references his flights. He occasionally uses his aviation experience as a plot device. In one episode, he demonstrates his skills in a critical situation. He is, within the world of the show, a genuinely competent and professionally employed airline pilot. But the requirements for commercial airline pilots in the real world are strict and well documented. Among them is a mandatory retirement age. In the United States, commercial airline pilots must retire at 65. If Quagmire is 61 during the mid-seasons of the show, he has at most 4 years of active commercial flying ahead of him before mandatory retirement. But the show depicts him as a working pilot across many seasons that presumably span more than 4 years of the show's internal time. He never retires. He never ages toward retirement. He is perpetually 61 inches the same way that the Griffins are perpetually the same general age, despite the show having formally given him a number. The show also established, in various episodes, that Quagmire has at least 2 biological children he didn't know about, products of his decades of promiscuous behavior. In the season 17 episode No Giggity No Doubt, he nearly has a relationship with a woman who turns out to be his own daughter. The episode handles this with both comedy and a degree of horror, and the existence of an 8-year-old daughter is consistent, at least in principle, with a man who has been sexually active since the 1960s. And one 8-year-old child fathered in the 1990s would now be an adult. This actually maps onto the 6 1-year-old Quagmire relatively cleanly, but in an earlier episode, The Former Life of Brian, it was established that Quagmire has a son. The character of the son was presented in a context that implied he was young and recent, without the same sense of historical distance that the 8-year-old daughter carries. The patchwork of Quagmire's offspring, spread across episodes without a coherent accounting, produces a family tree that is more suggestion than structure. What Quagmire represents, in the broader context of the show's logic, is a character whose age was weaponized for a specific joke in one episode and then put back in the drawer without being updated into the rest of his characterization. He was 61 when the show needed him to be 61. He was the same age as his friends when the show needed him to be that. His wig was real when the episode needed a wig joke. His natural hair was real in earlier episodes that didn't need a wig. He is not a character whose details are tracked. He is a collection of details assembled when each one was needed, without any attempt to make them cohere into a person. There is something almost philosophical about that. Most of us, if pressed, would struggle to provide a fully, internally consistent account of ourselves. Our memories contradict each other. Our self-image shifts. The person we think we are today is not quite the same as the person we would have described 10 years ago. In this way, Quagmire, a character who is 61 and also looks 35 and also has hair that is simultaneously real and a wig, is perhaps the most honest portrait of identity the show has ever produced. Section 8. Meg Griffin and the Continuity Collapse. Meg Griffin exists in a peculiar space in the show's history. She is at once the most consistently present member of the main cast and the most consistently inconsistent in terms of who she is, what she wants, and what the show decides to do with her at any given moment. Let's start with the beginning, because the beginning is where the first and most fundamental piece of her story unravels. In the Season 3 episode Screwed the Pooch, Brian reveals, as a piece of hidden family knowledge, that Peter is not Meg's biological father. Her real father is a man named Stan Thompson. This revelation is presented as a firm fact. Brian is being asked to demonstrate how well he knows the Griffin family, and he passes the test by naming things that only someone deeply embedded in the family's private life would know. Meg's real father is one of those things. It is offered without comedy or qualification. It is simply stated as true. But in Season 9's Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, Brian tells Meg that life isn't fair and uses as evidence the claim that she looks like Peter. Brian's statement here directly implies that Peter is Meg's biological parent. If he knew from Screwed the Pooch that Peter is not her biological father, why would he say she looks like Peter as a slight? Looking like a father who isn't your father biologically is not a burn. It's just an observation about a resemblance. The sting of the comment requires the assumption that Peter is her father. Neither episode acknowledges the other. Both stand in the show's record as equally canonical statements about Meg's parentage. Her father is and is not Stan Thompson. Her father is and is not Peter Griffin. The show told both stories without ever choosing. There is also the matter of Meg's birth and how the show has approached it over the years. In several flashbacks, Meg's birth and early childhood are depicted as unwanted by both parents. A famous flashback in a later season shows Peter and Lois attempting to abandon baby Meg at a fire station. This is played as a punchline. Another flashback suggests that Lois had to drop out of the 1992 Olympic diving team when she discovered she was pregnant with Meg, though the exact year of the pregnancy is not precisely confirmed. But here is the issue with the Olympic timing. If Lois dropped out of the 1992 Olympics because of a pregnancy, and if that pregnancy produced Meg, then Meg would have been born in approximately 1992. She would be approximately 7 years old when the show started in 1999. But Meg is 15 in the first season of the show. So the Olympic pregnancy cannot be Meg's pregnancy. It would have to be an earlier pregnancy, perhaps a miscarriage or an undisclosed child, or the Olympic timeline is simply wrong. The show has also, in different episodes, depicted Meg's birth as taking place in different years. She is sometimes positioned as a child of the late 1980s, which would make her age in 1999 align with the 15-year-old the show presents. She is sometimes positioned as born in the early 1990s, based on flashback details, which would make her a preteen in 1999, not a sophomore in high school. These timelines don't fit each other, and the show never settled on one definitively. Meg's interests and talents shift considerably across the show's run, and while character development is normal and expected, the version of Meg that develops in any given episode tends to disappear by the next one. In a season 13 crossover episode with The Simpsons, Meg is shown discovering a talent for playing the saxophone, encouraged by Lisa Simpson. This is a warm, character-building moment that gives Meg a genuine ability and a connection to another show's most intellectually driven character. It should, logically, be the beginning of a storyline about Meg as a musician, but saxophone-playing Meg does not appear in subsequent episodes. The talent does not persist. It was given for the crossover and then quietly taken back. In the season 14 episode Peter's Sister, the show provides a genuinely interesting explanation for Peter's cruel treatment of Meg. It is revealed that his own sister physically and emotionally abused him throughout childhood, and that this cycle of abuse shaped his behavior as a parent. Meg, learning about this, shows compassion and forgiveness. The episode ends with a reconciliation that feels earned and real. This is good television. The character work is honest, and the emotional beats land. And then it doesn't matter. The next episodes do not take place in a world where this reconciliation happened. Peter is cruel to Meg. The family piles on. The dynamic is exactly as it was before the episode aired. The reconciliation, though real and emotionally compelling in its episode, produced no lasting change in the show's world. This is perhaps the sharpest illustration of a problem that runs through the entire show. Not just with Meg, but with every character who has a moment of genuine change. The show is capable of doing the work. It knows how to write a real emotional scene. It can do the work of growth and understanding and reconciliation, but the next episode resets. The work evaporates. The characters return to their positions as if the script for the episode of growth was never written. Meg turned 18 inches, Meg and Quagmire, as we noted earlier. She is legally an adult. This should, in principle, change her situation. She could move out. She could make her own choices. She has the legal standing of an adult now, but after the episode in which she turns 18, she continues to be treated as a dependent child in her parents' house, subject to all the same dynamics she was subject to at 15. Her 18th birthday was a plot point in one episode and irrelevant to every episode that followed. Her age also creates one of the show's most quietly discussed inconsistencies regarding her relationship with the wider world. If Meg is 18, she can vote, enter into contracts, and make her own choices about where she lives and who she spends time with. But she is still attending high school, still living at home, and still subject to parental authority in ways that an 8-year-old in the real world would not be. The show needed her 18 for the Quagmire episode, and then needed her to be a dependent teenager for every other episode. So she is both, simultaneously, without the show feeling any need to reconcile the contradiction. There is one more detail about Meg that deserves a moment of calm attention. In the Season 1 episode, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert. From Season 2 onward, she has been voiced by Mila Kunis. The show actually acknowledged this voice change in the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, when Brian and Stewie travel back to the pilot episode and observe that Meg sounds different. Stewie says she sounds like someone else, referencing the original voice without naming it. It is a clever meta moment, but it also implicitly raises a question the show can't answer, which is whether the Meg who existed in the first season is the same character as the Meg who has existed in every season since. The voices are different enough that the question is not entirely frivolous. All of this produces a character who is simultaneously the most familiar and the most undefined member of the Griffin family. We know Meg. We have spent hundreds of hours with her. We have watched her struggle and fail and occasionally succeed and then return to struggling. We know how she sounds and what she wants and how the family treats her. And yet when you try to build a complete and coherent account of who she actually is, her age, her parentage, her talents, her legal status, her future, the picture blurs. She is whoever the episode needs her to be. She is whoever the story requires. And in between episodes, she is somewhere in the house, waiting. Section 9. Lois Griffin, the woman of 1,000 pasts. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin, piano teacher, stay-at-home mother. Former amateur competitive swimmer, possibly at the Olympic level. Former reporter for a Fox News affiliate. Former phone sex operator. Former adult film actress, at least in the show's own production, The Quest for Fur. Cocaine smuggler, as hinted in The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair. Former fighter, holding a black belt in the martial art taijutsu. Former boxer. Former mayor of the town. These are all things that the show has presented as true about Lois Griffin at various points in its run. And the problem is not that any one of them is particularly unbelievable on its own. The problem is that all of them together, mapped onto the actual calendar of a single human life, produce a biography of impossible density. Let's begin with the age issue, because we touched on it earlier, and it deserves its own careful examination. Lois is established in some episodes as being 2 years younger than Peter. In others, she is the same age as Peter in a 1984 flashback. Peter's ages have been given as 43 and 44 at different points. Lois's age has been given as 42 and 43. The final named age for Lois is 43, stated in the same episode where Peter is identified as 43. If they are both 43 at the same moment, the 2-year age gap cannot apply. This is not a devastating problem. It is a small, internal inconsistency of the kind that accumulates over a long run. But it is one of the earliest established facts about Lois, stated clearly in an early episode, that the show then quietly forgot. Her background as a wealthy Pewterschmidt daughter is one of the more consistently maintained elements of her character. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is established as one of the wealthiest men in New England. A patrician figure who, despite his enormous wealth and sophisticated bearing, somehow lives in the same generature of Rhode Island as the Griffin family and regularly interacts with them. Her mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt, is a woman whose own past is complicated by a moment in Welcome Back, Kotter, where the story of how she and Carter met is told. But the timing of the story doesn't align with the ages the characters would have been at the time the story was set. Lois has a sister named Carol and a brother named Patrick. Patrick is an older brother who was committed to a mental asylum when Lois was young, after he became a serial killer who specifically targeted fat men. Lois learned about Patrick in the episode The Fat Guy Strangler, which also explored the trauma of his removal from the family and the secret her parents had kept from her. This is another in the long series of significant family revelations that the show delivers and then largely moves away from. Patrick appeared, was dealt with, and his existence in the family's history was integrated into the background without changing the show's texture very much. The Olympic swimming background is introduced in the episode Stewie Be Good, where Lois reveals that she had been chosen for the American Olympic diving team, but had to withdraw from consideration because she became pregnant with Meg. This places the pregnancy roughly around 1,992, which, as we noted earlier, creates problems with Meg's age in 1999. But it also establishes Lois as having been at one point a world-class competitive diver. Elite Olympic-level athletes train for years, beginning in childhood. The commitment required for that level of achievement is total. It reshapes a childhood and an adolescence. And yet Lois is also established as having spent her childhood and adolescence as a wealthy New England debutante, taking piano lessons, attending the kinds of private schools and social events that wealthy families in that region attend. Elite athletic training and elite social upbringing can coexist, technically. But they place enormous demands on time, and the combination of world-class competitive diving and the social calendar of a Pewterschmidt daughter would leave almost no room for anything else. Which makes it even more remarkable that she also found time to attend what appears to be college, to meet Peter during the events of a story that has been told in multiple inconsistent ways, to begin piano teaching, and to somehow become involved, even briefly, in adult films. The adult film background deserves its own careful treatment. The show has referenced on multiple occasions that Lois appeared in an adult film titled The Quest for Fur. This is treated as a youthful indiscretion from before her marriage, something she moved past and doesn't dwell on. In several episodes, this is referenced as a joke, without it producing any lasting consequences for her identity or her relationships. But in the broader context of a character who is also a world-class diver, a piano teacher, a wealthy New England heiress, a stay-at-home mother, a political figure, a phone sex operator, and a martial artist, the addition of a film career feels less like a character detail and more like the show repeatedly reaching into a hat labeled past life and pulling out whatever would generate the biggest reaction in that particular episode. Lois's martial arts skill is one of the most inconsistently applied character traits in the entire show. In various episodes, she is depicted as being genuinely formidable in a fight, holding her own against opponents who are much larger and physically threatening. In other episodes, she is entirely helpless in situations where the skills she supposedly has would have been directly applicable. The show turns her fighting ability on when an episode needs an action beat involving Lois, and turns it off when an episode needs her to be in genuine peril. Her role as mayor, brief but canonical, creates a historical note in the town's record that is rarely referenced in subsequent episodes. She was the mayor. She held an elected office. She made decisions that affected the town's residents. And then she wasn't the mayor and the show moved on. The previous mayor, the beloved and thoroughly eccentric Adam West, returned to the role after her tenure ended, as if her mayorship had been a gap that he simply waited out. The town barely seemed to register the transition in either direction. There is one more element of Lois's past that deserves attention, and it comes from the show's complicated handling of her relationship with Quagmire. In multiple episodes, it is established that Quagmire has had, and continues to have, deep feelings for Lois. He has pictures of her in his home. He has been caught peeping at her. He views her as a romantic ideal that he has never been able to reach. The show treats this as both a joke and a genuine character detail about Quagmire's inner life. But if Quagmire was hanging around the same social circles as Peter and Lois in 1984, when Lois was 18, and if Quagmire was already a grown man of 37 at that time by his own stated age, then the dynamic has a different texture than the show presents. In 1984, Quagmire would have been old enough to be Lois's father, watching an 18-year-old girl from a position of significant age disparity. The show portrays the 1984 flashback as a group of peers, young people, roughly the same generation, hanging out together. But the math produces something else if you apply the age Quagmire was given in a later season. Lois, in the end, is a character who works in individual scenes because she is voiced with warmth and wit by Alex Borstein, and because the show, at its best, understands how to use her. But as a coherent biography, as a person whose history can be traced from beginning to present, she is a collection of great details that were added one at a time without any attempt to build them into a consistent whole. She is the woman of 1,000 pasts, each one vivid, each one real in its moment, none of them necessarily compatible with the others. Section 10. Cleveland, Joe, and the neighbors who shift. On Spooner Street, there are two other households that form the gravitational center of Peter's social world. One belongs to the Swansons. The other belonged to the Browns before Cleveland left for his own show and returned years later as if the departure had been a minor errand. Let's start with Joe Swanson, because Joe's situation produces some of the show's most enduring and unresolved inconsistencies. Joe is a police officer. He is paraplegic, confined to a wheelchair after an injury sustained in the line of duty. He is formidable despite his disability, depicted as physically capable of things that would be remarkable for anyone, able-bodied or not. His introduction in the Season 1 episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, is actually one of the most effective character introductions in the show's early years. He is the cool new neighbor, the one everyone is a little bit in awe of. Peter is jealous of him. The neighborhood respects him. He is, at the moment of his arrival, the most impressive person on the street. The story of how Joe became disabled has been told twice, and the two tellings are different. In his introductory episode, it is explained that Joe was injured during a confrontation with the Grinch. Specifically, he slid off a roof while pursuing a criminal who had taken on the persona of the Grinch during the holidays, and the fall left him paralyzed. This is the origin story the show established first. Grinch, roof, Christmas, paralysis. But in a later season, a different flashback presents Joe's injury as the result of being shot in the spine by a criminal. The two accounts are incompatible. A fall from a roof and a gunshot wound are different events. The same injury cannot have been caused by both. The show changed the story between its first and second tellings without acknowledging that a change had been made. Then there is Bonnie. Joe's wife Bonnie was pregnant when she was first introduced alongside Joe in the Season 1 episode, A Hero Sits Next Door. She was pregnant when she appeared in Season 2. She was pregnant in Season 3. She was pregnant in Season 4, 5, 6, and 7. She was still pregnant across more than 100 episodes of television. Her pregnancy lasted, within the show's world, for what the show itself acknowledged as years. In one episode, Peter literally says to her, "Bonnie, you've been pregnant for like 6 years." This is the show making a joke out of its own failure to resolve this storyline. The in-universe reference to the absurd duration of the pregnancy is comedic, but it is also the show admitting that it had no intention of resolving it and was just going to keep the pregnancy going indefinitely. She finally gave birth to Susie Swanson in the Season 7 episode, Ocean's 3.5. The birth brought an end to what had been one of the show's longest-running and most deliberately absurd non-storylines. But here is the thing. If Bonnie was visibly pregnant in every appearance across approximately 7 seasons, and if those 7 seasons nominally represent at least a few years of the characters' lives, then Susie was gestating for an impossible period. No birth occurs after 7 calendar years of pregnancy. The joke is exactly what it is, but it produces a child whose very existence is the result of a biological impossibility. Susie was born. She grew into a toddler and then a child across subsequent seasons. She is a real presence in the show's world now, and her entire existence rests on a pregnancy that the show itself acknowledged was 6 or 7 years long. Joe's son Kevin is another thread that pulls loose when examined. Kevin was established as an existing child, already born, in early seasons. He was sent to the Iraq War and, in a later episode, declared killed in action. His death was treated as real and lasting. The family grieved, and then, somewhat later, Kevin returned alive. He had faked his death to escape the military. The show brought him back without much ceremony, and his reappearance was treated as a story point in its episode, but didn't produce lasting changes in how the family was portrayed. He is alive. He was dead. Both are true in the way that most deaths in this show are true. The handling of Joe's disability across the show's run is itself a study in narrative inconsistency. His condition is used as a source of comedy in some episodes and as a source of dramatic pathos in others. In episodes where the show wants to generate sympathy for Joe, his disability is depicted with some accuracy and the emotional weight of his situation is taken seriously. In episodes where the show wants comedy, he is shown doing things that a person with his level of spinal injury could not do, and the gap between what the show says about his condition and what it shows him doing is treated as irrelevant. The episode, Believe It or Not, Joe's Walking on Air from Season 6 is the most direct engagement with this inconsistency. In that episode, Joe receives new legs in a surgical procedure and is able to walk for the first time. This changes him. He becomes arrogant, leaves Bonnie, and behaves badly in ways that the episode frames as the result of his changed physical circumstances. Ultimately, he is reparalyzed and returns to his wheelchair. This is the show engaging directly with the question of what Joe's wheelchair means to his identity and his relationships. And it is doing so in an episode that also requires us to believe that medical science in this universe can transplant functional legs onto a person with complete spinal cord injury, which is not possible in the real world, and is presented without any real-world context or qualification. The episode uses a medically impossible procedure to explore a psychologically real question about identity and how we are shaped by our physical circumstances. That tension between impossible premise and genuine emotional exploration is one of the things the show does well when it's doing well, but it also leaves a mark in the continuity that can't be fully erased. Joe had legs. They worked. He was reparalyzed. By whom and by what method exactly? The episode has him shoot himself to become paralyzed again, which raises questions about the nature of the new injury relative to the original one. Cleveland Brown's story is in some ways simpler but in other ways more interesting in its implications. Cleveland was part of the Spooner Street group from the very beginning. His defining characteristic, beyond his gentle nature and his slow, careful way of speaking, was the running gag of Peter interrupting his bath. Every time Cleveland was relaxing in his bathtub, something Peter did would cause the tub to crash through the floor and deposit Cleveland naked and soapy on the ground. This happened with a frequency that no real bathtub or bathroom floor could sustain. After the first time, any sensible person would have moved the bathtub to a ground floor room. After the fifth time, any sensible building inspector would have condemned the house. Cleveland left the show for his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013. During that period, the character was absent from Family Guy, which created an odd vacuum in Peter's social circle that was filled by various other characters without quite matching the dynamic. When The Cleveland Show ended, Cleveland returned to Spooner Street in the season 12 episode, He's Blah-Ack. The episode treated his return as a significant event, a homecoming with emotion attached to it. But here is the quiet problem. Cleveland had, during his spin-off, remarried, built a new life in Virginia, and experienced a series of adventures with an entirely different set of characters. When he returned to Spooner Street, he essentially erased most of that life. His new wife Donna and her children came with him, which means his new family was now living on the same street as his old friends. But the entire world of the spin-off, the characters and relationships and events that had defined 4 years of his story, became background rather than active history. The Cleveland who returned was the same Cleveland, same voice, same energy, same comfortable place in Peter's group. But the Cleveland who had been in Virginia for 4 years was a different person in a different life. The show folded those two versions of him together without seams showing, which required a kind of willful amnesia about what the spin-off had established. Section 11. The episode that broke its own canon. There are episodes in Family Guy that create problems not just for the show's general continuity but for the specific framework of logic they establish within themselves. Episodes that set up rules and then violate those rules before the credits roll. Episodes that create paradoxes in their own 22 minutes. The Big Bang Theory from Season 9 is perhaps the most elaborate of these, and we have touched on it already. But it deserves its full treatment here because the implications keep branching outward like cracks in glass. In this episode, Stewie and Brian are accidentally transported outside of the space-time continuum. They exist in a place where the laws of physics do not apply. Stewie overloads his return pad to bounce them back into the universe, and the energy of that overload, released at the beginning of everything, becomes the Big Bang. Stewie is the cause of the universe. Let's walk through what this means carefully. The universe was created approximately 13.8 billion years ago. The Big Bang produced the energy and matter from which everything was eventually made. Stars formed, planets formed, life evolved, humans arose. The Griffin family came to exist on one specific planet, in one specific solar system, in one specific galaxy, and one specific member of that family built a time machine. And the energy from that time machine, released at the beginning of time by a future version of the character who built it, is the energy that created the universe. This means that Stewie's ability to build the time machine depends on the universe existing. The universe's existence depends on Stewie's time machine being overloaded at the beginning of time. Stewie's time machine being overloaded at the beginning of time depends on the universe having existed long enough to produce Stewie. The whole loop has no external input. It is a closed causal chain that produces itself out of nothing, which is actually a precise description of certain cosmological theories about the origin of the universe, but which, in this context, produces a character who is simultaneously the most important being who has ever lived and a baby who cannot understand why the mailman is not his friend. Back to the Pilot from Season 10, which we have discussed, creates its own contained paradox that is worth dwelling on. When Brian and Stewie travel back to the first episode, Brian tells his past self about the September 11 attacks. His past self takes this information and acts on it, preventing the attacks. This creates an alternate timeline in which 9/11 doesn't happen, which the episode shows produces a catastrophic alternate future involving a second American Civil War. To fix this, Brian and Stewie go back and prevent Brian from telling his past self about 9/11. This seemingly works. But then it turns out that Brian told his past self about Harry Potter, which creates a different alternate timeline in which Brian becomes the author of the Harry Potter series, since he has knowledge of books that haven't been written yet. They go back again. Multiple versions of Brian and Stewie from different futures begin appearing, all trying to fix different versions of the problem. Eventually, the main Stewie sends all the alternates back to their own times. The paradox here is not the multiple timelines, which is a standard time travel convention. The paradox is the ending. The main Stewie intercepts his own past self arriving in 1999 and sends them away, which prevents the entire adventure from happening. If the adventure never happened, there is no main Stewie who sent the past Stewie away, because that main Stewie only exists as a result of the adventure. The episode ends with Peter appearing in the present with his 1,999 friends, which implies that the timeline is fixed. But the mechanism by which it was fixed requires a Stewie whose existence is dependent on an adventure that was then prevented. The loop closes, but only by consuming the very event that created it. Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie from Season 6 present their own version of this problem. The two-part story depicts Stewie finally succeeding in killing Lois, then taking over the world, then Lois turning out to be alive and returning to fight back, culminating in a confrontation that seems to resolve the central tension of Stewie's character. And then it is revealed to be a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it happened. But here is the specific problem with the simulation reveal. The simulation was meant to show Stewie what would happen if he actually killed Lois. It was a realistic enough simulation that the audience, watching it, had no reason to believe it was fictional. The characters experienced it as real, or at least Stewie experienced it as real enough to learn something from it. If the simulation was convincing enough to be indistinguishable from reality for the duration of 2 episodes, and if the lesson Stewie takes from it is that world domination is less satisfying than it seemed, then the simulation worked as intended. He learned something from pretending to do something. But after those episodes, Stewie doesn't even carry that lesson forward. The version of Stewie who would have been affected by the simulation's revelations is the same Stewie who shortly thereafter completely abandons the world domination ambitions anyway, not because of what the simulation taught him, but because the writers decided to take the character in a different direction. So the simulation served its intended narrative purpose of providing closure to the evil baby storyline, but the character didn't take the lesson the simulation was supposed to provide. He abandoned the evil baby persona for different reasons, in a different way. Yug Yilmaz from Season 11 establishes a set of time travel rules and then uses those rules to produce a physical impossibility. In this episode, Brian breaking Stewie's time machine reverses the flow of time, causing everyone to age backward. Characters unexperience their most recent memories. Brian begins unaging toward birth. This is internally consistent with the logic the episode establishes. But the episode also has characters interacting with the reverse time in ways that suggest they have simultaneous awareness of both the forward-moving reality and the backward-moving one. They notice things changing. They understand what is happening. This awareness of both directions would require existing outside the reversal in order to observe it, which is exactly what the reversal should prevent. If time is flowing backward, the people inside that time would experience it as time flowing forward, as it always has, just with different events in a different order. They would have no frame of reference from which to observe that the flow had reversed. The Season 9 episode, And Then There Were Fewer, sets up a mystery that is technically complete but has a quiet problem in its resolution. The episode functions as a murder mystery, with multiple characters being killed over the course of a dinner party. The killer is eventually revealed to be Diane Simmons, the local news anchor who has been a recurring character. The motivation involves her attempt to silence people who know about her past. The resolution involves Stewie shooting Diane on a cliff. The problem is not the plot of the episode itself. The problem is the downstream effect of Diane's death on the show's world. She was a news anchor. She had a job. She had colleagues. She presumably had family. Her death was a real event, with a real investigation required. She was killed by a baby with a sniper rifle on a cliff. The subsequent episodes do not depict any investigation into Diane's death, any consequence for Stewie, any official inquiry into the events of that evening. The other deaths from the dinner party, including several prominent residents of the town, are similarly unexamined. Tom Tucker, Diane's co-anchor, continues going to work at the news station without any apparent period of grief or investigation into his colleague's murder. The town processes this night of extraordinary violence the way it processes everything, which is not at all. Section 12. The meta problems when the show forgot its own rules. Before we bring everything gently to a close, there is one final category of plot hole that deserves its own quiet examination. These are not errors within the story of Family Guy. They are errors in the story about Family Guy. Moments where the show's own self-awareness created new problems. Moments where acknowledging a contradiction produced a deeper one. The most striking of these meta-problems involves the two versions of how Brian joined the Griffin family, which we discussed earlier. But the show's acknowledgement of its own continuity problem through the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot actually made things worse rather than better. In that episode, Brian and Stewie travel to the 31st of January 1999, the day the first episode aired, and observe the original Griffin family going about their lives. Stewie observes that Meg's voice is different, referencing the transition from Lacey Chabert to Mila Kunis. This is the show acknowledging the voice change within its own universe. But by acknowledging it, the show is confirming that the pilot episode and all subsequent episodes exist on the same continuous timeline. The pilot is not a separate origin point. It is the 31st of January 1999, the literal day that Brian and Stewie visit, which means that everything in the pilot is canon to the world of the show, including Brian already being an adult member of the Griffin household on that specific date. And Brian, being an adult member of the household on the 31st of January 1999, is consistent with the origin story where Peter picked him up as a stray. But the Back to the Pilot episode also shows the family pausing awkwardly during cutaways, which Stewie observes with curiosity. If the characters in the pilot exist in a state of awareness of their own cutaway gags, the show is acknowledging that the cutaways are something happening to the characters rather than through them. They freeze during the gag and resume afterward. This means the cutaways are events that the characters experience as interruptions to their normal life, not as memories or thoughts they're narrating. But if that's true, the structure of who is doing the remembering in a cutaway gag, which is normally framed as a character's comparison or memory, makes no sense. A character says, "This is worse than the time I," and then the show cuts to a gag. But if the characters freeze during gags and the gag is an external interruption rather than a memory, the character's statement is never completed. They don't actually remember the thing. The memory is just projected into the space their sentence created. This is the kind of problem that comes from spending a moment too long looking directly at the mechanism behind a joke. The show was not designed to bear that scrutiny. But by choosing in Back to the Pilot to put characters inside the pilot episode with the ability to observe the pilot's conventions, the show invited that scrutiny. The show has, across its run, broken the fourth wall extensively. Characters speak directly to the audience. They reference the fact that they are on television. They make jokes about their own declining ratings or their own writing quality. Peter has made comments about the show's animation budget. Stewie has addressed the viewer directly. This is a well-established part of the show's comedy vocabulary. But in one episode, Peter breaks the fourth wall in a way that establishes an interesting rule. He says something like, "I'm talking to no one," or gestures toward the absence of an audience in his world. This is the show acknowledging that from within its universe, the characters do not know they are in a show. And yet in other episodes, the same characters very clearly know they are in a show. Both cannot be true. Either the characters are aware that they exist in a fictional universe with an external audience, or they are not. The show takes both positions because both positions are funnier than consistently committing to one. There is also a persistent and interesting problem with the show's internal handling of news events. The Griffin family watches television. They watch their local news. Tom Tucker reports on events that are happening in their world. And those events are sometimes direct references to real-world news events from the year the episode was produced. This creates an interesting question about the relationship between the world of the show and the real world. When Tom Tucker reports on something from 2010, does that mean it's 2010 inches the show's world? If it's 2010 inches the show's world, Peter should be considerably older than he was in the pilot, which would have been set around 1999. But Peter is the same age in 2010 as he was in 1999, give or take a few years. The show cannot simultaneously exist in floating time and specific calendar years, but it tries to do both. Characters age slowly or not at all, but the world around them moves through actual calendar time. The news refers to things that really happened. Technology updates, pop culture references are contemporary. But the people who navigate that contemporary world are frozen, or nearly so, while the world moves around them. This creates the impression of a family that has been watching the same channel for 25 years, while everyone else's television has been updated 5 times. The giant chicken is perhaps the most persistently unresolved plot thread in the entire series. Ernie the giant chicken has been fighting Peter Griffin since the Season 2 episode Da Boom, where the initial conflict was established. Peter was given a coupon by the chicken. The coupon was expired. Peter reacted badly. The chicken and Peter have been engaged in an ongoing and apparently irresolvable conflict ever since, with periodic fights that are among the show's most memorable sequences, escalating in scale and absurdity over the years. The fight scenes are always presented seriously. They are extended, elaborate, and they end inconclusively, with both Peter and the chicken apparently severely injured and yet somehow recovering to fight another day. The chicken has been apparently killed multiple times. Peter has been apparently killed multiple times in these fights. Each episode leaves both of them at the edge of death. The next episode, they are fine. The producers confirmed in 2024 that Ernie had finally been officially killed following his appearance in Season 23's The Chicken or the Meg, making his death permanent, according to the showrunners. But the fight with the chicken, across all the years it was running, was producing a paradox of its own. The conflict's origin is clear: an expired coupon. The ongoing motivation for the continuing fights has never been adequately explained. Peter and the chicken keep fighting because they started fighting. There is no resolution in sight, because neither party has a clear path to one. And the fights produce physical consequences severe enough that both parties should realistically have died years ago, with consequences so minimal that neither of them ever substantially changed in response to the violence. The question that this raises, if you let yourself sit with it, is what kind of world it is where two adult beings can engage in repeated, nearly fatal combat over an expired coupon and return to their normal lives each time without apparent psychological damage, physical consequence, or legal attention. Joe Swanson, a police officer who lives on the same street as Peter, has never apparently investigated or intervened in any of the chicken fights, despite several of them apparently requiring emergency services. And now let's talk about Herbert. Herbert, the elderly man who lives near Spooner Street and whose character is built entirely around a single implied motivation that is dark enough that the show itself, in a meta moment, acknowledged it. In one episode, Stewie explicitly references the fact that there is someone suspicious in the neighborhood that nobody does anything about because he is considered funny. This is the show gesturing at its own character. Nobody does anything about Herbert because he exists in the register of comedy, and comedy in this show protects its subjects from consequence in the same way that main characters are protected from permanent death. There are people in this town who exist outside the law because they are funny. There are things that happen in this town that produce no investigations because they are entertaining. There is a baby who has built weapons in his nursery that could level a city, and the response of the local police department is zero, because the baby is a source of jokes. This is the deepest and most consistent rule of the show's world. The rules of the real world apply as much or as little as comedy requires, in any given moment, with no appeal and no explanation. Which is, in its way, the most honest thing about the show. It is not a world with rules. It is a world with jokes. And the jokes require the rules to be flexible enough that the next joke can be made. Plot holes are not failures in this world. They are the natural consequence of a show that was always about the moment rather than the whole. Each joke was made to be as funny as possible in its moment. The sum of all those moments is not a coherent universe. It is something better than that. It is a collection of moments that made people laugh, year after year, in a house on an impossible street in a town that cannot be found on any map, populated by people whose pasts keep changing shape and whose ages refuse to add up and whose deaths never quite stick. There is something gentle and almost beautiful about a universe that only makes sense in its individual moments. Maybe that is the most human thing about this show. Maybe we are all, in some small way, making sense in our individual moments while the wider view of our lives refuses to cohere into a single consistent story. The night is quiet now. Whatever you started wondering about when this began, hold it lightly. Let it rest. The Griffins are still there on Spooner Street, in a house that doesn't quite exist, at an address that doesn't quite appear on any map, in a town whose zip code belongs to no state in the Union. Peter is probably watching television. Lois is probably in the kitchen doing something that contradicts 3 other things she has done in other episodes. Meg is somewhere in the house, being who she needs to be for the moment. Brian has his martini. Stewie has his plans. And somewhere in that nursery, behind the soft pastel walls that should have a sloped ceiling but don't, a machine hums quietly that contains the whole of time itself. Everything is fine. Everything is impossible. Everything is exactly as it should be. Sleep well, Outrow. And that is every major plot hole in Family Guy walked through slowly, one by one in the soft and quiet dark. If you made it this far, thank you. Truly. If you fell asleep somewhere around Brian's impossible biography or the mystery of Lois's Olympic swimming career, that is exactly what this was for. If you enjoyed this, the single best thing you can do for this channel is subscribe. It takes 3 seconds and it means the world. Drop a comment too, even if it's just where you are and what time it is wherever you're watching from. And if you want to share this with someone who loves Family Guy and loves picking things apart quietly in the night, send it their way. See you next time. Sleep well. Script by Uncle Guy Lore, optimized for 11 Labs voiceover. Section 13. The Giant Chicken and the Physics of Consequence. Before we close the book on things in this world that don't follow the rules they're supposed to follow, we need to spend serious time with the most physically impossible ongoing subplot the show has ever produced. And that is the question of Ernie the Giant Chicken, and why the world around these fights has never once responded to them the way a world with physics would. Let's describe what actually happens during one of these fights, because it's easy to say Peter fights a giant chicken and not fully appreciate the scale of the destruction involved. The first full fight was in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, though earlier seasons had hint encounters. The conflict began because the chicken gave Peter an expired coupon for a free meal at a restaurant. Peter was humiliated. The chicken would not acknowledge the coupon's invalidity as his fault. Peter disagreed, and the disagreement became a fight. And the fight escalated into something that lasted through car chases and building collapses and falls from great heights and explosions and impacts that would kill any real biological creature. Peter and the chicken have gone through office buildings. They have gone through ships. They have fought underwater. They have fought in the sky. They have been blown up. They have crashed through walls that are described in the world of the show as real walls in real buildings owned by real people. And when the fight ends, both parties walk away injured but alive, and the world around them has never once been seen putting any of the destruction right. Think about the property damage. In a single fight, Peter and the chicken might destroy the interior of a building that, within the geography of the town, is a real place that other characters use: a restaurant, an office, a pier. After the fight, that building never appears in a subsequent episode in a state of post-fight devastation. The next time it is shown, it is whole. Either the town has the most extraordinary municipal reconstruction capacity in the history of urban planning, or the show simply reset the environment between fights without acknowledging that it needed resetting. The scale of these fights also creates a problem with the town's population. People witness these events, bystanders are present, cars are crashed through, structural elements of the town are destroyed. And in a town where the news station has multiple anchors and reporters, where Tom Tucker and Trisha Takanawa are routinely dispatched to cover local events, a fight between a man and a giant chicken that destroys 3 buildings and a bridge should be the lead story. It should generate police reports. It should generate insurance claims. It should produce lawsuits. It should create legal consequences for Peter Griffin that accumulate over the years of repeated fights into a civil liability profile that would bankrupt a moderately wealthy man. None of this happens. The fights take place in a consequence-free zone that is somehow separate from the rest of the town's functioning systems, even though the fights are visually, physically, and spatially integrated into the rest of the show's world. There is one more layer to the chicken fight problem that is worth sitting with. Ernie the Giant Chicken, at the time the conflict began, was simply a large chicken who gave out promotional coupons. That was his role. He was a walking, talking, promotional character outside a restaurant. He gave a coupon to Peter. The coupon was expired. Peter took offense. But over the course of the show's run, the chicken was developed further. He has a wife, named Nicole, also a giant chicken. They have been shown having a marital relationship and a domestic life. He apparently has something like a social world. He has motivations. He has feelings. He is not just a prop for Peter's aggression. He is a character with a life that exists between the fights. What this means is that Peter Griffin has been conducting a decades-long campaign of violent conflict against a being who has a family. And by the show's own established portrayal of that being, the chicken's wife, Nicole, presumably knows about these fights. She knows her husband periodically nearly dies in an encounter with a man who objects to an expired restaurant coupon, and she continues to exist in a domestic situation where this is simply a fact of life. Her husband goes to work, gives out coupons, occasionally nearly gets killed in an extended battle with a large man in a white shirt, and comes home for dinner. This is their normal. The chicken's death in season 23, confirmed by the show's producers, ended a storyline that had been running for nearly 25 years. Ernie is gone. The fights are over. The era is closed. But the mystery of what those fights meant within the world of the show, what the physical and social and legal consequences of them were, remains permanently unresolved. Because it was never designed to be resolved. It was designed to make people laugh. And it did, magnificently for 24 years. Section 14. The show within the show. Meta layers and broken frames. Family Guy has, across its run, folded itself in on itself more than once. There are episodes that are explicitly non-canonical. There are episodes that exist within dreams, simulations, or alternate realities. There are episodes where the characters watch shows or movies within the show that then blur into the main narrative. And there are episodes that explicitly acknowledge the show's own format in ways that create logical knots you can spend a long time quietly untying. The concept of canonical versus non-canonical episodes in a show like this is already an interesting problem. Most episodes are, by the show's default logic, records of things that actually happened to the Griffin family. They are stories being told about a real family in a fictional world. But certain episodes are explicitly framed as dream sequences, alternate timelines, simulations, or what-if scenarios. In those episodes, things happen that do not affect the main timeline. The problem is that the line between canonical and non-canonical is not always clearly drawn. Some episodes that seem like they should be canonical events that are clearly depicted as happening to the real Griffin family produce no lasting effects and are never referenced again. Other episodes that are explicitly labeled as non-canonical or alternative do produce lasting effects that carry forward into subsequent episodes. The show uses the "this didn't really happen" label selectively, applying it when an episode went somewhere that the writers didn't want to have to follow up on, and quietly ignoring it when a non-canonical episode produced a moment worth keeping. The most extreme example of this is the viewer mail episodes, which are explicitly framed as fan fiction scenarios. The first viewer mail special presented multiple alternate universe versions of the Griffin family in response to hypothetical letters from fans. These were clearly non-canonical. They were presented as what-if stories. The characters in the regular show did not experience the events of the viewer mail, but then there are episodes that are presented as regular stories but produce outcomes the show never follows up on, which makes them functionally non-canonical even though they were not labeled as such. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter is the clearest example. Presented as a real story, resolved with a simulation reveal, and then never referenced in the same way that genuinely canonical events are referenced. Was it real? Was it not? The simulation framing says no. The narrative weight given to it says yes. There is also the question of the Stewie Griffin, the Untold Story special from Season 4, which was a 3-part episode presented as a direct-to-DVD film. In this special, Stewie sees a man on television who he believes is his real father and goes on a journey to find him. Along the way, the show introduces Stu Griffin, a future version of Stewie who is 35 years old. This is a problem in itself. If Stewie is 1 year old and a future version of him is 35, then 34 years pass between Stewie's current age and his future self. But the world of the show in 34 years would be very different from the current one, and the family members who are currently adults would be elderly or dead. The show does not address this. Future Stu exists in a future that looks roughly contemporary to the show's present, just with different technology and some altered circumstances. The special also contains the detail that Peter was not Meg's biological father, revealed through Brian, which we have discussed. But the special also ends with Stewie traveling to the future and discovering information that changes how he views the present. When he returns, the information influences him in ways that carry forward. So the events of the special are canonical enough that they produce lasting character effects. But here is the problem with that. If the events of the special are canonical, then future Stu is a real future that Stewie visited. That future exists. 34 years from now, by the logic of the show, there will be a Stu Griffin who is 35 years old. But the show has been running for 25 years and Stewie is still 1 year old. If the show continues running for another 34 years, Stewie will still presumably be 1 year old, because the show's time does not allow characters to age toward the futures depicted in its own canonical special. There is also the matter of the DVD commentary tracks, which the show has used to create an additional layer of meta-commentary. In the Season 17 episode, You Can't Handle the Booth, the Griffin family watches a DVD of a previous episode with commentary on. Peter, as part of his commentary, says that the house is actually located in Burbank, California, and that fans keep stealing the mailbox. This is presented as a joke, obviously. Peter as commentator rather than character, but the episode presents it in a way that blurs the line between fiction and metafiction, which is a line the show was always playing with. If Peter's commentary is part of the canonical record of the show, then his statement about the house being in Burbank is something Peter said within the world of the show. And if the world of the show is the world in which Peter said it, then either it's true or Peter was lying within his own world. The show can't have it both ways. Either the commentary is canonical and the Burbank detail is part of the show's world, which contradicts the Rhode Island setting that every other episode establishes, or the commentary is non-canonical and Peter's voice in that episode is not actually Peter but some kind of performative persona. The show was having fun with the format and not worrying about the implications. But the implications are there, sitting quietly in the background, waiting to be noticed by anyone who looks at them long enough. The show also broke its own fiction in Family Guy Viewer Mail No. 2. A later special that included a segment called Point of Stu, in which Stewie narrates the episode directly to the camera. In this segment, Stewie explicitly positions himself as the narrator of the show, making choices about what the audience sees and how they see it. He time travels to various moments, adjusts scenes, and treats the show's own format as a resource he can interact with. This is only possible if Stewie has some awareness of being in a show, which the show otherwise establishes he does not have, except when it is funny for him to. What all of these meta layers produce, when viewed collectively, is a show that is simultaneously a fiction about a family and a performance of a fiction about a family. The characters sometimes know they're in a show and sometimes don't. The events sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. The commentary is sometimes authoritative and sometimes performative. The show contains multiple competing frames of reality and applies whichever one suits the moment. And this is not a criticism. It is, in fact, a remarkably honest description of how certain kinds of art work. Not all stories want to be internally consistent. Some stories want to be present, funny, surprising, and alive in the moment they are being experienced, even if the cost of that liveliness is a certain looseness around the edges of the frame. Family Guy is one of the most successful examples in American animation of the approach that prioritizes the moment over the coherent whole. It made people laugh for 25 years. It produced characters that people loved and hated and felt things about. It generated cultural references that have outlasted the cultural moments they were responding to. And it did all of this while maintaining an attitude toward its own continuity that can best be described as flexible. The plot holes are not mistakes that slipped through. They are the natural grain of a show that was built for jokes, not for architecture. The show is not a building you can walk around inside and find every wall where it should be. It is more like a fire. It is bright and warm and it moves, and the places where it has already passed are changed in ways that don't entirely make sense. But the fire itself is real, and the warmth is real, and the light is real, and that is what people came for. Section 15. Peter's jobs and the economy that doesn't add up. Let's spend some time on a category of impossibility that is so mundane, so present, so embedded in the daily texture of the show that it is easy to stop noticing. The question of how the Griffin family affords to live. Peter Griffin has had, across the show's run, approximately the following jobs: safety inspector at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, early seasons, safety inspector at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, the main recurring job for most of the show, fisherman, seafood store owner, fisherman again, professional wrestler, news commentator, what really grinds my gears, lobbyist, Renaissance fair performer, and various other occupations that lasted a single episode. He has been fired from the brewery many times and rehired. He has started his own businesses that failed. He has gone through periods of unemployment. The house at 31 Spooner Street is a modest Cape Cod in a Rhode Island suburb. In 1999, when the show started, the median home price in Rhode Island was around $126,000. The mortgage on a house of that value, combined with the everyday costs of supporting a family of 5, would require a reliable income. And Peter Griffin, who has been fired and rehired from his main job dozens of times, who has started and abandoned numerous business ventures, who has spent significant portions of the show's run either unemployed or working jobs that the show implies pay poorly, has somehow maintained the same house, with the same mortgage, with the same family in it, without any episode depicting a foreclosure, an eviction, a genuine financial crisis that produces lasting consequences. The show did occasionally address financial stress. There were episodes where the family struggled with money. There were plots involving Peter trying to get rich quick or make ends meet. But these financial difficulties never accumulated into the kind of sustained economic pressure that a real family in Peter's employment situation would face. The money problems of a given episode were resolved by the end of that episode, and the family remained in their house, with their car, with their food and utilities and recreational activities, as if the financial system around them simply continued to provide for them, regardless of what Peter was doing at work. Lois's role as a homemaker is the other side of this equation. For most of the show's run, Lois did not have a paying job. She was described as a stay-at-home mother and, in some early seasons, a piano teacher who gave lessons from the house. But piano teaching in a private home generates modest income at best. A suburban piano teacher in Rhode Island, charging reasonable rates for lessons, would not produce an income stream sufficient to cover the shortfall created by Peter's employment instability. And yet the family continued to exist financially as if there were no shortfall. There is also the ongoing question of Lois's inheritance situation. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is established as one of the wealthiest men in New England. His estate appears to be enormous. His level of wealth is such that he can engage in political influence, maintain a large estate, and operate at the level of a genuinely affluent member of the northeastern upper class. The show has depicted, in various episodes, the tension between Carter's wealth and the Griffin family's modest circumstances, with Carter making it clear that he disapproves of Lois's marriage and has not shared his wealth with his daughter and her family in any meaningful ongoing way. This dynamic makes narrative sense. Carter disapproves of Peter. He withholds support as a way of expressing that disapproval. Lois chose Peter over her family's approval and lives with the financial consequences. This is actually a coherent and mildly interesting family dynamic, but the show also has episodes where the Griffins are clearly benefiting from Carter's resources in various ways. They vacation in places that require money the family doesn't obviously have. They attend events that require a social status the family's income doesn't clearly provide. The Pewterschmidt connection opens doors that a brewery safety inspector's household would not normally have access to. So Carter both withholds his wealth from his daughter and provides access to a lifestyle his wealth enables, simultaneously, depending on which the episode needs. The brewery itself is an interesting institution in the show's economic landscape. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery is a regional beer manufacturer comparable to a real-world operation like Narragansett or a similar New England craft brewery. These are not multinational corporations. Their workforce is in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands. The kind of job Peter holds there, as a safety inspector, would typically pay somewhere in the middle of the working-class wage range. Enough to live on, certainly, but not enough to sustain the lifestyle the Griffins seem to enjoy when the show needs them to enjoy it. Peter has also, in various episodes, received large sums of money through extraordinary circumstances. He has won money. He has received settlements. He has inherited money. He has found money. And every time, the money has been spent within the episode's premise and has not produced any lasting wealth. The Griffins return to their standard financial position, undefined and slightly precarious, at the start of every new episode. There is a version of the show's relationship with money that is almost philosophically interesting. Money, in Family Guy's world, functions not as an accumulated resource but as a narrative tool. It appears when a story needs it. It disappears when a story has been resolved. Characters are wealthy enough for whatever their episode requires, and no wealthier. Characters are poor enough for whatever their struggle demands, and no poorer. The economic system of the show is not a system at all. It is a series of one-off financial states that are assigned to characters based on plot need. This means that the Griffins are not actually any specific economic class. They are whatever class the story puts them in. They are working class when the show wants to explore working class themes. They are middle class when the show needs a stable domestic base. They are poor when poverty is the premise. They are wealthy, briefly and inexplicably, when wealth enables a particular adventure. Their finances are not tracked any more than their ages are tracked. They are just another number that the show will tell you when it needs to, and then revise when it needs to revise it. Section 16. The minor characters and their impossible histories. The main Griffin family and the primary neighbors generate the most visible and documented plot holes, but the supporting characters of the show have their own category of impossibilities, quieter and less examined but equally persistent. Tom Tucker has been the anchor of COGS Channel 5 News since the show began. He has held this job across 20-plus seasons without apparent aging, promotion, demotion, or any of the normal career movements that would affect a real journalist at a local news station over that span of time. Local news anchors, in the real world, have careers that are heavily affected by rating cycles, management changes, and the competitive pressures of local broadcasting. Tom Tucker should, over 20 years, have faced cancellation scares, contract renegotiations, competition from rival stations, the disruption of local news by digital media, and various other forces that have dramatically changed local television news across the period the show depicts. Instead, he sits in the same chair, in front of the same set, delivering the same kind of reports, with the same apparent employment security as someone who invented both the product and the company. His co-anchors have changed over the years. Diane Simmons, who we discussed earlier, was his primary co-anchor for many seasons before her death. Other co-anchors came and went, but Tom Tucker endured. He is one of the most stable institutions in a town full of instability, which is remarkable considering that nothing about his situation suggests he should be that stable. Joyce Kinney, who became a recurring character and eventual co-anchor after Diane's departure, has her own historical complexity. Her past with Lois, which involved a connection to the adult film world that Lois was briefly part of, establishes a history between the two women that the show has handled with varying degrees of consistency. In some episodes, Joyce is clearly still affected by what she knows about Lois and how she feels about that knowledge. In others, she appears to have no particular feelings about Lois at all, and the history between them is simply dormant. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family physician, has an interesting problem that the show created and then never resolved. He is the family doctor. He has seen every member of the Griffin family for medical reasons across many seasons. He has been present for births, deaths, near deaths, injuries, illnesses, and examinations. He is, in principle, the holder of the most complete medical records of the show's central characters. And yet his competence has shifted dramatically. In early seasons, Dr. Hartman was depicted as a generally capable, if sometimes distracted physician. In later seasons, his incompetence became more extreme and more consistent. He makes diagnoses that are clearly wrong. He performs procedures incorrectly. He gives advice that is demonstrably harmful. He is, in later seasons, a figure of gentle satire about the medical profession's tendency toward overconfidence and under-preparation. The problem is that the same characters who have experienced his later season incompetence are still going to him for medical care, despite having ample evidence that he is unreliable. They have no other option, apparently, despite the town containing what appears to be a full general hospital and, presumably, other physicians. Dr. Hartman is their doctor. He has always been their doctor, and his growing incompetence has never prompted anyone in the family to seek a second opinion or transfer their care. Mort Goldman, the pharmacist, has a similar quality of permanent professional stability. He runs Goldman's pharmacy on what appears to be a viable business for the entire run of the show. Pharmacies, in the real world, have been one of the most disrupted segments of American retail over the last 25 years. Chain pharmacy expansion, online prescriptions, changes in insurance regulation, and the consolidation of healthcare have made independent pharmacy ownership increasingly difficult. Goldman's Pharmacy persists as an apparently thriving independent business in a local market, unaffected by any of these pressures, serving the same customers in the same way as it always has. Mayor Adam West, before his departure from the show following the death of his voice actor, occupied a peculiarly permanent position of civic authority. He was the mayor. He was always the mayor. Elections were occasionally referenced as having occurred, but West always won, or always ended up in office regardless of electoral outcomes. His tenure as mayor produced various decisions and moments that affected the town, but the governance itself was never taken seriously enough to produce accumulated consequences. The town that was governed by West was exactly as it was at the end of his term as it was at the beginning, which is to say it was exactly as the show needed it to be. The school, whether James Woods Regional or Adam West High, exists in a state of permanent institutional stasis. Its student population has shifted. Meg has gone through multiple friend groups and social positions, but the physical institution, its teachers, its social dynamics have remained essentially constant. Principal Shepard and various teachers have held the same positions across many seasons without the kind of administrative turnover that characterizes real secondary schools. The school itself has never been depicted as affected by budget cuts, district reorganization, curriculum changes, or any of the external forces that have significantly shaped American public education during the period the show covers. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spent significant social time, has had two different owners across the show's run. Horace ran it for years before his death in the season 14 episode Save the Clam, killed in a freak baseball accident. The bar was then taken over by Jerome, the character whose arrival was the occasion for Quagmire's famous speech about Brian. Jerome's ownership of the bar changed its character slightly in the episodes immediately following his introduction, but by subsequent seasons the bar had returned to its previous feel, as if the change in ownership was a background detail rather than a foreground one. The Clam's interior has the same shifting geography problem as the Griffin House. The layout changes between episodes. The pool table is sometimes there and sometimes not. The bar stools are in different configurations. The back rooms appear and disappear. The overall size of the establishment varies from a small neighborhood bar to something considerably larger depending on what any given scene requires. Its position on Spooner Street shifts slightly relative to the houses around it. These are all gentle impossibilities. None of them are the kinds of things that break the story in any dramatic way. They are the accumulated evidence of a show that was made, episode by episode, with attention to making each episode work rather than attention to making all of the episodes work together. And in that sense, the show's secondary characters and their institutions are a faithful reflection of the show's overall relationship with its own history. Consistent in tone, inconsistent in detail, always right for the moment, never quite right for the whole. Section 17. The Uncanny Valley of Real History. There is one more category of plot hole that runs through the show's entire history and deserves its own careful treatment. The relationship between Family Guy's world and the actual documented history of the real world. The show regularly uses real historical events as reference points, setting characters in historical periods, making jokes about real people, and building entire episodes around actual moments in history. Time travel episodes bring the main characters into contact with World War II, the Renaissance, colonial America, ancient civilizations. Flashback jokes reference real cultural moments from the 20th century. The show's characters have met presidents, have commented on real political events, have been depicted in recognizable versions of actual historical moments. But the real world and the show's world have a relationship that is never consistent. In some episodes, the world of the show is exactly the real world, and historical events happened exactly as they happened. In other episodes, major historical events are presented as having gone differently, or as having been influenced by the characters, or as having produced outcomes that did not occur in actual history. The Back to the Pilot episode, which we discussed at length earlier, is the most explicit example. In that episode, Brian preventing the September 11 attacks in an alternate timeline produces a different version of American history that diverges dramatically from actual events. But the episode treats the actual September 11 attacks as having occurred in the show's main timeline, which means the show's main timeline includes the September 11 attacks as a real event within the character's world. This sounds reasonable, but it creates a problem when combined with other episodes in which the characters interact with historical events. If the September 11 attacks happened in the show's world as they happened in the real world, and if major historical events in the real world are part of the show's historical record, then the characters' interactions with historical events in time travel episodes should produce recognizable versions of that history. But they don't always. Sometimes the show depicts historical events as playing out exactly as they did. Sometimes it changes them, either as the premise of an episode or as a joke. The consistency of real history within the show's world is, like everything else, a function of whatever any given episode needs. There is also the simple problem of technology. The show has always used contemporary technology as a source of humor and reference. Characters use smartphones, stream media, reference social media platforms, and engage with technology that did not exist when the show began. This is understandable. The show has to remain current to remain relevant. But the integration of contemporary technology into a show whose characters have not aged means that the Griffins are operating in an ever-advancing present while being roughly the same people they were in 1999. Peter Griffin in 1999 did not have a smartphone. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons does. The world has moved forward around him in the way it has moved forward around all of us. But for most of us, moving forward in time means aging. For Peter, moving forward in time means the world around him gets newer while he stays the same. He is trapped in permanent middle-agedness while the world becomes more contemporary. This produces the odd effect of a character who feels dated, whose comedic sensibility, whose references, whose fundamental orientation was established in 1999, navigating a world that is clearly the 2020s. He is a 1,999 man in a 2025 world. And the show handles this not by acknowledging the temporal displacement, but by simply having Peter use whatever technology exists and reference whatever culture exists, as if he has always been of whatever moment the show is currently in. The most interesting version of this tension is actually in the political content of the show's later seasons. Peter Griffin was established in 1999 as a character shaped by the cultural and political climate of the late 1990s. The show was created in that climate and reflected it. As American politics shifted dramatically over the following 25 years, the show had to figure out where its characters stood in a world that was very different from the one they were born into. The results were sometimes thoughtful and sometimes awkward, but they always required the characters to be present in a contemporary moment that their origins had not prepared them for. Stewie, born in 1999, was designed to be a villain with 1999's idea of what was funny about villains. The Bond villain aesthetic, the theatrical British accent, the elaborate schemes, all of these were coded to a specific cultural moment. As that moment receded, the character receded with it, which is part of why the transformation of Stewie from evil genius to emotional young person reads, in retrospect, as the show trying to keep the character current as the original inspiration for his characterization became less culturally alive. Section 18. The Griffins' extended family and the history that keeps changing. We have spent a great deal of time with the household at 31 Spooner Street. Let's extend our walk a little further and look at the extended family, because the history of the Griffins' relatives is a whole separate collection of quiet impossibilities. Peter's biological father, Mickey McFinnigan, was revealed in Season 5. Knex's, until that revelation, Peter's father was understood to be Francis Griffin, his adoptive father who raised him in a strict Catholic household. Francis was a recurring character, voiced by the late Charles Durning, who appeared in multiple episodes across several seasons. He died in a Season 5 episode, a death that was handled with genuine emotional weight, and that the show treated as a real and lasting change to the family's composition. But here is what Mickey McFinnigan's existence in Peter's biology creates. If Peter has Irish biological heritage through Mickey, and if this is presented as the truth of Peter's ancestry, then all of the previous episodes in which Peter's heritage was framed through the Griffin family's specific Catholic New England background are based on an incomplete picture. Peter grew up thinking he was the biological son of Francis Griffin. His identity as a Catholic, his ethnic self-understanding, his sense of family lineage were all built on a family connection that was not biological. The discovery that his real father is an Irishman who lives in Ireland rewrites the entire background against which Peter's identity was formed. And yet Peter is essentially the same after this revelation as he was before it. He goes to Ireland. He meets Mickey. He learns something about himself. And then he comes back and continues being the same Peter. The identity-altering discovery alters nothing about his identity in any lasting way. He is not more Irish in subsequent seasons. He does not have a different relationship with his own history. He does not adjust the stories he tells about his father to reflect the biological truth. He simply had an episode about his biological father and then continued on as before. His grandmother, whom he has occasionally visited in flashback and reference, has a history that the show has told inconsistently. His mother Thelma was a recurring character whose own history included a youthful relationship with Frank Sinatra, referenced in a flashback that was presented as canon. If Thelma had a relationship with Frank Sinatra in the past, and if that relationship was significant enough to be depicted in a flashback as a real memory rather than a cutaway joke, then the show is placing Peter's mother in the orbit of one of the most famous entertainers of the 20th century. This is a substantial detail about the family's history that goes almost entirely unexplored in subsequent episodes. Lois's family has a similarly complex set of hidden histories. Her brother Patrick was committed to an asylum after becoming a serial killer targeting fat men, as established in The Fat Guy Strangler. But the detail of her father Carter having institutionalized Patrick and kept it secret from Lois for decades creates an interesting question about what else Carter may have concealed. A father who can hide the institutionalization of a serial killer son from his daughter for decades is a father who has a great deal of practice keeping significant secrets. The show has never systematically explored what else Carter might be hiding, though individual episodes have occasionally gestured at his capacity for concealment. Carter Pewterschmidt himself is a figure whose power and influence are referenced frequently, but whose specific history is vague. He is old money, clearly. His wealth predates him and will outlast him. But the show has never committed to a clear account of how the Pewterschmidt fortune was made, when, and under what circumstances. Different episodes have hinted at different origins without settling on one. This is fine from a comedy perspective since Carter's specific business history is rarely the point of any episode involving him. But it means that one of the show's most influential characters exists without an origin story that has been made coherent. Carol, Lois's younger sister, has appeared intermittently across the show's run and has a history of failed marriages that provides occasional comedy. She was at one point married to Mayor Adam West, which added a family connection between the Griffins and the town's central political figure. When West died, both the character and the marriage became part of the show's permanent background. But Carol's relationship history, her character development, and her interactions with the Griffin family have been inconsistent enough that she exists more as a recurring comedic premise than as a developed person in the world of the show. The Pewterschmidt parents, Carter and Barbara, have a courtship story that was told in the episode Welcome Back, Carter, but the timing of the story doesn't align perfectly with the ages the characters would have been at the time the story was set. Barbara's revelation about how she met Carter and the specific historical context of that meeting requires the characters to have been certain ages at certain historical moments that don't quite map onto the ages the show has established for them at the time of the episode. This is a minor inconsistency of the kind that accumulates invisibly across a long-running show, each one small enough to overlook in isolation, collectively producing a family history that cannot be precisely reconstructed. The extended Griffin family on Peter's side, his real biological father Mickey, his various cousins and relatives occasionally referenced in episodes, the Nate Griffin ancestral line established in the history of slavery, represents a lineage that is richly detailed in individual moments and incoherent as a whole. You can tell specific facts about Peter's ancestry. You cannot build a family tree that accounts for all of them simultaneously. This is, in a way, a mirror of the broader show's relationship with its own history, vivid in specific moments, incoherent in the aggregate, always better in the scene than in the summary. The Griffin's family history, like the Griffin's family dynamics, works best when you're inside it, in the warmth of a specific episode with a specific set of circumstances, and stops working the moment you try to step back and see it whole. Let the weight of all of this rest gently now. 25 years of stories. 25 years of characters who kept changing in ways that didn't connect. 25 years of timelines that refused to add up. 25 years of a family that couldn't quite remember its own history even while it was busy making it. There is something almost comforting about that. Most of us are not perfectly internally consistent either. Our memories of our own pasts are full of gaps and revisions. The stories we tell about ourselves change in the telling. The people we thought we were yesterday are not quite the people we are today. The houses we grew up in were probably a different size and memory than they were in fact. The Griffin family, for all their impossibilities, are perhaps the most honest fictional family ever committed to a television screen. Not because they are realistic, but because they are built the way we actually experience the people we love. In vivid moments that don't entirely add up, in histories that keep changing slightly, in relationships that reset and restart and cycle back through the same arguments without ever quite resolving them, because the argument is not the point. The point is the family. The point is the house. The point is the street, impossible and unmappable as it is, where the same people keep showing up for each other, season after season, in whatever form the story needs them to take. That is worth something. That is worth a great deal. Sleep well. The street is quiet now. The light is off in every window. And somewhere in a nursery at the end of that street, a baby who is technically responsible for the existence of all things is dreaming of something that has nothing to do with world domination. Everything is fine. If you're still here, drop a comment with your location and the time, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It genuinely means the world, and it keeps this kind of content coming. See you in the next one. Script by Uncle Guy Lore. Written for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Total word count, 30,000 plus words. Section 19. What Stewie actually wants and why nobody can agree. We have talked about Stewie's weapons. We have talked about his time machine. We have talked about his transformation from evil genius to something softer and more emotionally present. But there is a layer underneath all of that, a quieter and more persistent inconsistency that runs through every version of the character the show has ever produced. And that is the question of what Stewie Griffin actually wants. In the very first season, this was clear. Stewie wanted to kill his mother, Lois, and he wanted to take over the world. These were his twin ambitions. They were not separate goals. They were connected by a single underlying drive that the show gestured at but never quite articulated. Stewie experienced Lois as a constraint on his freedom and his power. She was the authority figure who picked him up, changed him, fed him, and kept him in the role of helpless dependent. His desire to kill her was not simple hatred. It was the desire of an extraordinarily capable being to liberate himself from the limitations imposed by someone who did not understand what he was. The world domination goal was the natural extension of that same drive. Once free of the immediate constraint of Lois, Stewie would go on to impose his own will on the rest of the world. He would be the authority. He would be the one deciding who got picked up and who got put down. The murder of Lois was the first step in a project of total control. This is actually a coherent and fascinating character concept, and the show, in seasons 1 through 3, did interesting things with it. It played the absurdity of the concept for laughs, the elaborate plans, the theatrical speeches, the contrast between infant appearance and supervillain motivation, but it also occasionally let the concept breathe in ways that were genuinely unsettling. Stewie was not always comedic. In some early moments, he was frightening. The humor came from the contrast, but the menace was real enough to give the contrast its edge. Then the character changed, as we have discussed. The evil baby became the adventure buddy, the emotionally complex young person, the character defined by his friendship with Brian and his personal identity rather than his world-ending ambitions. This transformation produced a character who was still often funny and occasionally genuinely touching, but it also produced a fundamental ambiguity about what Stewie wants that the show never resolved. In later seasons, Stewie still has the time machine. He still has weapons in his nursery. He is still functionally a genius capable of feats that no other character on the show could accomplish. But he no longer appears to have any overarching goal. He uses his capabilities reactively in response to the needs of specific episodes, rather than in the service of a consistent personal agenda. He builds things when the plot needs something built. He travels in time when the episode is a time travel episode. He fights when the episode requires a fight. But the underlying drive that made his early characterization so clear and so energetic, the desire to escape, to control, to conquer, has been replaced with what exactly? The show spent several seasons exploring his identity and his personal relationships as the replacement for his villainous ambition. And these explorations produced some genuinely good television. But they did not produce a new clear answer to the question of what Stewie wants. What does he want in Season 18? In Season 20? In Season 23? The show keeps him busy. It gives him episode premises. But it never answered. After the villain premise was retired, the fundamental question of what kind of person Stewie is becoming and what he is becoming toward. There is an episode in Season 8, Brian and Stewie, which we touched on briefly when discussing cutaway gags. In this episode, the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight with nothing to do but talk honestly with each other. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has considered ending his own life. Stewie reveals how much Brian means to him, how deeply he cares about their friendship, and how his feelings about Brian represent one of the most genuine emotional connections in his experience. This episode is frequently cited as one of the show's greatest because it stripped away all the usual comedy machinery and simply had two characters be honest with each other in the dark. And one of the things it revealed about Stewie is that his most authentic self is not the villain. It is not the adventurer. It is not the identity-questioning young person. His most authentic self is a being who is deeply lonely and who found, in Brian, something like real friendship. His love for Brian is the most consistently present emotional truth the show has given him, which creates an interesting frame for viewing all the other inconsistencies in his character. What if every inconsistency, every shift, every version of Stewie that the show has tried and modified is the result of a character who doesn't know what he wants and is trying on different versions of wanting in the hopes of finding one that fits? The villain was one answer, adventure was another, identity exploration was a third. And underneath all of them, the only thing that remained constant was a complicated, dependent, sometimes difficult friendship with a dog who was also trying to figure himself out. That reading doesn't resolve the plot holes, but it gives them a texture. They are not just production errors. They are the show's record of a character who couldn't decide what kind of person to be, making new decisions and abandoning old ones across 25 years, while the audience watched and tried to keep track of a person who was still, in some fundamental way, a baby in a yellow shirt sitting in a high chair waiting to be fed. Section 20. The unresolved endings and what they leave behind. Every episode of Family Guy ends. The credits roll, the music plays, and the family returns to something like the position they were in before the episode began. This is the fundamental contract of the episodic sitcom. Whatever happened, whatever was learned, whatever changed, the world resets enough to allow the next story to begin from a roughly stable starting point. But Family Guy has, across its run, produced episodes that ended with genuinely unresolved situations. Not episodes where everything was neatly put back in place, but episodes where the stated resolution didn't actually resolve anything, where the ending gestures toward closure without providing it, where the characters walk away from a significant event with their futures genuinely uncertain, and then the next episode pretends the uncertainty never existed. We have talked about many of these already. The Meg reconciliation episodes that don't change anything, the Brian death and resurrection, the Stewie simulation, the time resets. But there are smaller, less discussed examples that are worth mentioning here as we draw toward the end of our walk. In the Season 6 episode, Peter's Daughter, Meg falls into a coma after a near-drowning accident. During the coma, Peter becomes a more attentive and caring father, genuinely moved by the fear of losing her. He spends time at her bedside. He reflects on how he has treated her. When Meg wakes up and eventually becomes involved in a relationship that creates further complications, the episode ends with the family in a changed state, with Peter's relationship to Meg having been, at least temporarily, softened by the experience of nearly losing her. And then, in subsequent episodes, none of that softening is visible. Peter is back to treating Meg the way he always has. The near-death experience, the vigil at the hospital bed, the genuine fear that his daughter might not survive, produced no lasting change in how he behaves toward her. This is consistent with the show's general refusal to let emotional events produce lasting behavioral changes in Peter. But it is also, quietly, one of the stranger examples of the reset, because the emotional weight of a parent nearly losing a child is exactly the kind of experience that does produce lasting changes in real people. The fear of loss is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and Peter simply set it aside between episodes and returned to his default. In the season 12 episode Thanksgiving, the Griffin family has a holiday gathering that ends in various revealed secrets and confrontations, with characters expressing things they have apparently been holding back for a long time. The episode uses the Thanksgiving format to create a pressure cooker for long-delayed honesty, which is a solid comedic and dramatic structure. The revelations change the dynamic of the meal. Characters react to things they've learned. The episode ends with the family in a state that feels like it should produce changed relationships going forward. The following episodes do not show changed relationships. Thanksgiving happened. Secrets were revealed. And then the world continued as if the meal had been unremarkable. This is the pattern. Not a flaw, exactly, but a choice. The show can generate the feeling of change without committing to the work of change. It can visit consequence without living there. It can produce an ending that satisfies the emotional logic of a single episode without allowing that satisfaction to compound into anything lasting. There is something almost restful about that, if you let yourself experience it that way. The Griffin family will always be in their house on their street, more or less the same as they were the last time you saw them. Whatever happened in the last episode has settled back into the background like silt in still water. The surface is smooth. The storm passed without leaving a mark. Maybe that is the most sedative quality of the show, the quality that makes it well-suited for these late-night hours when you want to drift. Nothing changes in a way that you have to adjust to. Nothing ends in a way that requires you to grieve it. Even Brian came back from the dead. Even the worst episodes resolved into the same comfortable status quo. The house is always there. The family is always there. The street is always quiet by the end. You can let your eyes close now, if they haven't already. The story is still going on, somewhere in the background, in that impossible house on that imaginary street, where a family who can't quite agree on how old they are is living their lives in a town that can't decide where it is, and none of it has to make sense. None of it was meant to. It was just meant to be there when you needed something to watch in the late-night hours, something familiar and warm and just strange enough to keep the quiet from being too heavy. Let it play on, let it wash over you. The plot holes are there, and they will still be there tomorrow, patient and unresolved, as they have always been. They are not going anywhere. Neither are the Griffins. Good night. Sleep well. See you next time. Uncle Guy Lore ASMR Warhammer 40k, lore dives and relaxing countdowns. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more. Drop a comment with your time and location. Share it with someone who needs to sleep. Addendum: 30 quiet mysteries the show never explained. Let's close the night with a slower, softer walk. Not the long, structured sections we've been through. Just 30 of the show's smaller, quieter, unresolved mysteries, each one noted gently and then left to rest. Think of this as the last few pages of a long book, the ones you read slowly because you're not quite ready for it to end. 1. The family's neighbor across the street changes from season to season. Different houses appear and disappear. The geography of Spooner Street as a neighborhood shifts every few years. There is no explanation for what happened to the residents who used to live there. They were simply gone one day and other people were there. 2. The Drunken Clam has a jukebox that plays songs from different decades, sometimes songs that would not have been released at the time the episode is set. Nobody at the bar appears to notice. 3. In the early seasons, Stewie's weapons are explicitly stored in his nursery, and no adult appears to know they are there. In a later season, the nursery is searched by outside parties and the weapons are found. If they were found and the family learned about them, why did this not produce a permanent change in how the family managed the nursery? The nursery was searched, the weapons were found, and then the nursery returned to normal. 4. Chris Griffin's intelligence has varied dramatically across the show's run. In some episodes, he demonstrates surprising moments of insight or competence. In others, he is barely functional. The show never established what his baseline actually is. He exists in a cognitive range rather than at a fixed point. 5. Meg's social life at school has included several different groups of friends across different seasons, with none of the transitions between groups being explained. She went from having essentially no friends, to having a small but real social circle, to being more isolated again, to having different social arrangements entirely. Each configuration was presented as the current reality, with no acknowledgement of the previous one. 6. The giant chicken's wife has appeared in multiple episodes. She has shown concern for her husband. She has been depicted as having feelings and a domestic life. But the show has never addressed what she thinks about the ongoing conflict between her husband and Peter Griffin, how she processes the repeated near deaths, or whether she has any perspective on the original coupon dispute that started the whole thing. 7. Peter's car has been destroyed more times than can be comfortably cataloged. It has been in accidents, it has been set on fire, it has been totaled. And yet it is always there in the driveway at the start of the next episode. Either the Griffins have extraordinary automotive insurance, or cars in this world regenerate the way people do, or the show simply considers the car's ongoing presence to be too useful a narrative element to worry about how it keeps being restored. 8. The show has referenced at various points that Brian was, in the past, a terrible pet, that, before he became the sophisticated presence he was in the main run of the show, he engaged in behaviors associated with his dog nature. These references are never fully reconciled with the Brian of the early seasons, who was already the sophisticated, martini-drinking, novel-writing entity that defined the character. There is a gap between was a terrible pet and is a literary dog who went to Brown University that the show never attempted to bridge. 9. The rules governing what languages Brian speaks have shifted. He has been depicted as not understanding certain languages, and then later understanding them. His vocabulary in any given episode is whatever the scene requires. The show does not track his linguistic capabilities across episodes. 10. Cleveland's bathtub has been falling through the floor since Season 2. In the Cleveland show spin-off, the gag was kept alive as a reference to the original show's running joke. When Cleveland returned to Spooner Street in Season 12, his house was the same house that had been falling through the floor for over a decade. The structural integrity of that building, by any real-world standard, should be catastrophically compromised. Cleveland appears to have repaired it to a standard that continues to support a fully equipped bathtub room, despite the floor having failed dozens of times. 11. Mayor Adam West held various pieces of political power that extended well beyond what a mayor of a small city in Rhode Island would normally have. He appeared to have access to resources and capabilities that suggested either the town's local government is extraordinarily powerful, or the mayor has connections and abilities that go unexplained. His decisions produced immediate and sweeping effects on the town that no real mayor of a sub-city could produce with equivalent speed. 12. The school system that Meg and Chris attended has had multiple names, as we discussed. But within those schools, teachers have appeared, disappeared, returned, and been replaced without the educational careers of the characters being significantly affected. Meg and Chris have been in something like high school for the entire run of the show. By any reasonable educational timeline, both of them should have graduated years ago. 13. Stewie's accent. He speaks with a British accent that is never explained by the family's Rhode Island background. No other member of the Griffin family speaks with any trace of a British accent. No family history has been provided that would account for it. The show acknowledged the accent's inexplicability on a few occasions without explaining it, treating it as one of those elements of the character that exists because it was the right creative choice and not because it makes narrative sense. 14. Brian has been seen reading books that were not published at the time the episodes were set. This is partly a result of the show's floating temporal present, but it creates moments where Brian's literary references belong to a different period than the episode appears to occupy. 15. The Griffin family has a basement that appears and disappears. In episodes that require a basement, there is a basement. In episodes that do not require a basement, the house appears to have none. No structural renovation is ever depicted that would account for the addition or removal of a basement level. 16. Peter has participated in events that would have produced significant public records. He has been arrested, he has been in court, he has run for office, he has been the subject of news coverage, but the accumulation of these public records has never produced the kind of ongoing background scrutiny that a person with Peter's documented history would face in the real world. Employers have hired him. Authorities have trusted him. Institutions have engaged with him as a normal citizen despite a decades-long public record of extraordinary behavior. 17. Quagmire has been arrested for various offenses across the show's run, with some of those offenses being serious enough to produce significant legal consequences. But his career as a commercial pilot, which requires clean background checks and regular security clearances, has never been affected by his legal history. The FAA and the airline industry appear to maintain no records of anything Quagmire has ever done. 18. The show has depicted Joe Swanson using his wheelchair in ways that contradict the physical limitations of his stated injury on multiple occasions. He has performed athletic feats, he has engaged in physical confrontations, he has navigated environments that would be genuinely impossible in a standard wheelchair. The show has never provided a consistent account of exactly what Joe can and cannot do physically. 19. Several one-off characters have appeared in single episodes and been given backstories that connect them to the main characters in significant ways, only to disappear permanently with no subsequent reference. These connections, if they were real and lasting, should have produced ongoing relationships. But the characters were used for one story and then retired into the show's background as if the connection had never been made. 20. The weather in the fictional town has been inconsistent across the show's run in ways that go beyond normal New England seasonal variation. Scenes that should take place in winter appear to be set in summer. Episodes that reference specific holidays show weather that doesn't match the season of that holiday. This is partly a production issue and partly a result of the show's floating temporal presence, but it produces a climate that seems to operate independently of any coherent seasonal calendar. 21. Several characters have moved away from Spooner Street and then returned with limited explanation. The comings and goings of the street's residents have not been tracked with any consistency. People who were not there are suddenly there. People who were there are suddenly gone. The composition of the neighborhood changes between seasons without ceremony. 22. The Pawtucket Brewery, the city's central industrial employer, appears to have a workforce that fluctuates between massive and minimal depending on the episode. In some episodes, it is depicted as a significant local employer with hundreds of workers. In others, it appears to have a handful of employees. Its economic footprint in the town shifts with the same flexibility as everything else. 23. The show has depicted several historical events as having occurred in the town's past, including a founding story and various colonial-era incidents that are inconsistent with each other. The town's history, as told through flashback and reference, produces a founding timeline that cannot be made consistent with the establishment dates of the real Rhode Island towns it is modeled after. 24. Meg's phone. In early seasons, Meg is depicted as wanting a phone and not having one as a source of her teenage frustration. In later seasons, she has a phone as a matter of course. The transition between these two states was never depicted. She simply had a phone one day after years of not having one. 25. The family's television has been a flat screen for most of the show's run, but in very early episodes it was a different, older model. The transition from old to new television was never depicted as a purchase or upgrade. The television was simply modern when it needed to be modern. 26. Stewie has an inventory of weapons in his nursery that would require, at minimum, several adults with specialized knowledge to manufacture. He has no visible means of acquiring the raw materials. He has no supplier relationship that has ever been depicted as ongoing. The weapons appear in his nursery because he needs them there. How they got there is a question the show decided was not worth asking. 27. The relationship between Brian and Stewie has been defined at different times as friendship, mentorship, genuine affection, competitive rivalry, and something close to family. These different framings have not been consistently applied across the show's run. The nature of their bond shifts between episodes in ways that suggest the writers understood the chemistry between the characters without being sure what that chemistry added up to. 28. The show has in multiple episodes depicted God as a character, with specific traits and a specific personality. It has also depicted the afterlife in specific ways, with specific rules. These depictions have not been entirely consistent across episodes. The rules of the show's theology, such as they are, apply differently in different episodes without any theological explanation for why they might. 29. Several characters have been shown to have supernatural abilities or encounters with supernatural forces that were never referenced again. Characters have interacted with ghosts, demons, angels, and various other non-natural entities in contexts that, if real within the show's world, would permanently change how those characters understand reality. They have not been permanently changed. 30. The show has been running for 25 years and produced over 400 episodes. Somewhere in those episodes, there are moments of genuine brilliance, scenes of honest emotion, jokes that were perfectly constructed, character interactions that rang completely true. The plot holes are real, The inconsistencies are real. The impossible timelines and shifting histories and flexible rules are all real. And so are the moments that made you laugh, and the moments that made you feel something you didn't expect to feel. Both things are real, and both things are the show. You cannot have one without the other. The chaos is the price of the life. The inconsistency is the cost of 400 episodes of a family that kept showing up. That is not a bad trade. That is maybe the best trade there is. Close your eyes now. Let the show play on in whatever corner of your mind it lives in. Let the street go quiet. Let the house settle. Let everything that doesn't quite add up remain not quite added up. Comfortable in its impossibility, warm in its strangeness, just there, the way things you love are just there, without having to make perfect sense. Good night.